There's a moment when a good man runs out of options, and the only thing standing between his daughter and the street is a job he doesn't know he already deserved. Ethan Walker was 32 years old, working nights to keep the lights on, watching his 8-year-old daughter fight for breath in a second-floor apartment with mold creeping along the bathroom wall, an eviction notice on the door, a medical bill on the counter, and somewhere across the city, a CEO who had never forgotten the stranger who saved her on the worst night of her life, without ever knowing his name. Drop a like and comment your city below. Let me show you how far this story travels. The eviction notice had been taped to the door at some point between 6:30 in the morning, when Ethan left for his second job, and 2 in the afternoon, when he came home smelling like industrial cleaner and sweat, to find Sophie sitting on the bottom stair of the landing with her backpack still on, staring at the piece of paper like it might say something different if she looked at it long enough. She was 8. She shouldn't have known what an eviction notice was. "Dad," she said when she heard his boots on the steps. "I see it." He said it quietly, the way you say something when you're trying not to let the weight of it land too hard. He peeled the notice off the door, folded it once without reading it. He already knew what it said, had already gotten the voicemail from the building manager, had already done the math in his head 3 different ways and come up with the same ugly answer every time, and unlocked the door. Sophie followed him inside. The apartment was small and getting smaller every month, or at least it felt that way. 2 bedrooms, though the second was barely more than a closet with a window. The carpet near the front door had started pulling up at the corners. The radiator knocked and hissed through the night. The bathroom had developed a patch of dark discoloration near the base of the wall that the landlord had painted over twice without ever fixing the source, and every time the humidity rose, the smell came back with it. Ethan had complained. The landlord had sent someone who looked at it, nodded slowly, and never returned. He set his keys on the counter and looked at his daughter. Sophie was small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth that she'd had since last spring, when the tooth finally came out after weeks of wiggling it. She had her backpack unzipped now and was pulling out a drawing she'd done at school. Something in crayon, a house with a chimney and a tree out front, the kind of house that existed mostly in children's drawings, and not in the neighborhoods Ethan could afford. "My teacher said I could bring it home," Sophie said. "It's good," Ethan said. He meant it. "You gave it a red door. Red is your favorite." "Red is my favorite," he agreed. He opened the refrigerator, moved a few things around with the automatic focus of someone doing inventory rather than looking for something specific. A half-gallon of milk that was 2 days from the date, leftover rice from 2 nights ago, 3 eggs, some cheese that was on its way out. He closed it and stood there a second with his hand still on the handle. 32 years old. This was not where he'd imagined being at 32. He pulled out the rice and started heating it. Check. Claire Walker had died 4 years ago, which meant Sophie had been 4 years old and Ethan had been 28, and completely unprepared for both of those facts. The accident had been the kind that people described as senseless, a phrase Ethan had come to despise because it implied that other accidents made sense, that there was some version of tragedy you could prepare for if you just thought hard enough about it. Claire had been on her way home from a late shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Rain, a driver who ran a light. 42 minutes from when the call came to when Ethan arrived at the emergency room. And it was already too late. He hadn't slept properly for 2 years after. Hadn't really eaten. Had done the mechanical things. He showed up for Sophie, kept the apartment, kept the lights on, but had operated largely on autopilot in a fog that he hadn't noticed lifting so much as thinning, slowly and inconsistently, over a very long time. What people didn't tell you about grief was that it didn't follow the schedule they laid out in the pamphlets. It didn't move through stages in order. It ambushed you in parking lots and grocery stores, and at 8 in the morning when you were trying to make breakfast, and you reached for a mug that wasn't there anymore because it had been hers, and you'd put it in a box in the closet because looking at it hurt, but throwing it away felt like something you couldn't come back from. But Sophie had needed him, consistently and without pause, and that had been the thing that made him keep moving. Not the motivational idea of it, the plain, practical, urgent reality of a child who needed dinner and a bath, and someone to check under her bed and make sure her inhaler was full before she went to sleep. Sophie had been diagnosed with asthma at age 5. Mild at first, the kind that showed up seasonally and responded well to her rescue inhaler. But over the past year, it had shifted into something more persistent, more reactive, more likely to announce itself without warning. The apartment hadn't helped. The mold in the bathroom, the dust the radiator kicked up when it fired to life in the morning. The building was old and the air quality was bad, and Ethan knew it and couldn't do anything about it because the alternatives cost money he didn't have. Her specialist, a pediatric pulmonologist named Dr. Anand, who was patient and thorough and who Ethan trusted completely, had told him 6 months ago that Sophie needed a controller medication, a daily inhaled corticosteroid that would reduce the baseline inflammation and significantly lower her risk of severe attacks. The medication existed. It was effective. And it wasn't fully covered by the bare-bones insurance plan Ethan was on, which left him with a monthly copay that, stacked against rent and utilities and groceries and everything else, became one more plate he was trying to keep spinning. He'd been managing. But managing was different from stable. Managing was what you did right before something broke. The second job had started 3 months ago. After the first job, warehouse work, physical and reliable if exhausting, had cut everyone's hours following a contract loss. Ethan had gone from 40 hours a week to 26, and the math had gone from tight to impossible almost overnight. He'd picked up shifts cleaning at a hotel downtown. Not degrading. Work was work, and Ethan had enough sense not to attach his self-worth to a job title. But brutal in the way that 2 physically demanding jobs in the same day were brutal. He'd come home some nights with his lower back locked up and his hands dry and cracked from the cleaning products, and he'd sit on the edge of his bed for a few minutes before going in to check on Sophie, just needing 30 seconds where nobody needed anything from him. It wasn't self-pity. He wasn't built for self-pity. It was just the reality of running a body at a pace it wasn't designed to sustain long-term. The eviction notice was for 11 days out, $1,400 in back rent, plus a late fee that added another $200. He had $472 in his checking account and a week until his next paycheck from the warehouse, which would be smaller than usual because of the reduced hours. The hotel paid every 2 weeks, and he was 6 days from that cycle completing. He'd done the math. He was going to come up short by approximately $800. The rice finished heating. He scooped it into 2 bowls, added the cheese because it made it better, and called Sophie to the table. She came in and sat down and picked up her fork, and then looked up at him with those dark eyes that were so much like her mother's that it still sometimes stopped him cold. "Is everything okay, Dad?" He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, gap-toothed, still wearing her backpack strap on one shoulder because she'd forgotten to take it all the way off. "We're going to figure it out," he said. It wasn't a lie. He intended to figure it out. He just didn't know exactly how yet. He'd seen the job posting 3 days before the eviction notice. He'd been sitting on the floor of the living room at 11 at night, Sophie asleep, the apartment quiet except for the radiator, going through a folder of printed job listings he'd accumulated from the library computer because his phone data had run out, and he was rationing it until the new billing cycle. He had a highlighter and a yellow legal pad, and he was making a list of anything that looked possible. Decent pay, overnight or early morning hours so he could still be home when Sophie got back from school. Benefits that might cover the specialist visits, something within a commute he could manage without a car. Most of what he found was either too far, too entry-level to cover the bills, or had already closed. He was halfway through the folder and his coffee had gone cold when he found the posting on a single printed page near the bottom of the stack. Crosstech Group, overnight maintenance technician, full-time. Benefits eligible after 60 days. Competitive wage. Apply in person or online. Crosstech was a mid-sized technology and facilities management company headquartered in a glass tower downtown, the kind of place you drove past and didn't think much about unless you worked there or needed something from them. He'd heard the name before, mostly from news pieces about their CEO, a woman named Ava Cross who had taken over the company at 27 after her father, the founder, had stepped back for health reasons. She'd apparently restructured most of the company in her first 2 years and turned a failing division profitable. The kind of story that business publications printed in a specific tone that was hard to parse, somewhere between admiring and slightly threatened. Ethan didn't have a strong opinion about Ava Cross. He cared about 2 things: full benefits after 60 days and whether the hourly rate would be enough to close the gap. He did the math on the legal pad. If the posted range was accurate, this job alone would cover rent with some room left. Combined with reduced warehouse hours, or eventually replacing the warehouse entirely, it would be the first time in over a year that he'd have something that felt like financial ground beneath his feet rather than water. He circled the posting with the highlighter. Then he went back and circled it again, harder. Shoved. The Crosstech building was on a block where the sidewalks were clean and the landscaping was maintained, and the glass on the lobby doors was the kind of glass that looked like it got cleaned twice a day. Ethan showed up for the in-person application process in the only pair of pants he owned that didn't have a small tear somewhere, with a folder containing his work history printed on paper he'd bought at the dollar store because the library's printer had been down. There were 4 other people in the waiting area when he arrived. 2 men who looked younger than him, 1 woman around his age, and an older guy who had the build of someone who'd done physical work most of his life and was probably good at it. They all had the same slight tightness around the eyes that Ethan recognized. Everyone in that room needed this job. The HR coordinator who came out to collect applications was a man in his mid-30s named Dennis Cho, who had the slightly distracted efficiency of someone managing too many tasks at once. He collected folders, handed out forms, answered questions about the timeline without really looking at anyone. Ethan filled out the form carefully. His hands were calloused, and one of his knuckles had a scab from catching it on a shelf at the warehouse 2 days earlier, and he was aware, sitting in that lobby with its expensive furniture and its quiet air conditioning, of exactly how much distance existed between where he was and where this building expected its occupants to be. He filled out the form anyway. When Dennis came back to collect them, he paused for half a second at Ethan's. "You've done facilities maintenance before?" 4 years, Ethan said. "Commercial and residential. I've got HVAC certification, basic level. And I did electrical assistant work for about a year before the warehouse job. Everything's on the work history page." Dennis looked at the paper, looked at Ethan. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but attention. "We'll be in touch," he said. They called 3 days later. An interview, the following morning, 9 o'clock. Ethan told Sophie over breakfast. She looked up from her cereal with a serious expression, the way she got when she understood something was important, even if she didn't have all the context. "Is it the good job?" she asked. "It might be." "The one with the doctor insurance?" "If I get it, yeah." She thought about this for a moment. Then, "You'll get it." "You don't know that," he said. "You always fix everything," she said. "That's your thing." He looked at his daughter and felt the particular ache of being seen clearly by someone who didn't yet understand that the fixing was never as effortless as it looked. "Eat your cereal," he said. The interview was with Dennis and a woman named Patricia from HR operations, in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. The building's interior was what Ethan had expected: clean, functional, the kind of corporate aesthetic that cost money to look effortless. He noticed, on the way up in the elevator, that 2 of the overhead lights had a slightly different color temperature than the others, suggesting a recent replacement with mismatched bulbs. He noticed that a hinge on the stairwell door he passed was starting to pull loose from the frame. He noticed these things the way a certain kind of person always noticed them, not because he was looking, but because his eyes defaulted to what needed attention. The interview itself was straightforward: work history, experience with specific systems, how he handled emergencies, availability for overnight shifts. He answered everything directly, without overselling, without the performance of confidence that sometimes backfired. When Patricia asked him about a gap in his employment record 2 years after Claire died, a period of about 4 months where he'd worked only sporadic temp jobs, he told her the truth. "My wife passed away. I had a young daughter. It took me a few months to find a way to do both things at once." Patricia wrote something on her notepad. Dennis looked at the table for a second. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was its own kind of response. "Is the overnight shift manageable with your current situation?" Patricia asked. "My daughter's 8, he said. "She's in school during the day. My neighbor, Mrs. Navarro, watches her on school mornings when I'm coming off shift. We've worked it out." He didn't mention Sophie's asthma. He didn't mention the eviction notice. He answered what they asked and nothing beyond it, because over-explaining your hardship in a job interview was a way of asking to be pitied rather than hired, and he'd rather be hired. Basse. The offer came 4 days later. Voicemail from Dennis at 4:47 in the afternoon. Position was his if he wanted it. Start date the following Monday, orientation at 7 a.m., bring ID and documentation. Ethan was in the parking lot of the warehouse when he listened to the message. He sat in his car, a 2011 Honda Accord with a crack in the dashboard and a check engine light that had been on for so long it had become ambient, and listened to it twice. Then he called Mrs. Navarro to confirm she was still good for Monday mornings. Then he called Dr. Anand's office to ask about the benefits processing timeline. He didn't call anyone to celebrate. There was no one in particular to call. He had friends, a couple of guys from the warehouse, a few people from the neighborhood, but none of them were waiting by their phones for this. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the window down, listening to the traffic, letting the news settle into him. It wasn't the end of anything. He knew that. It was a job, not a rescue, and jobs could end and situations could shift and nothing was solved yet. But it was something. It was a door that had opened where the last 3 he'd tried had been locked, and he was going to walk through it and do what he always did, show up and do the work. He drove home, made dinner, did Sophie's reading homework with her. She was working through a chapter book about a girl who trained horses, which she'd read 3 times already because she liked it that much. He listened to her read, correcting pronunciation here and there, and when she'd finished her 2 chapters and gone to brush her teeth, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote out the payment plan he was going to propose to the building manager in the morning. He couldn't pay the full $1,400 immediately, but he had a job now, a real one, and that changed the negotiation. He sealed the eviction notice in an envelope and wrote a note on the outside. Working on it. Have a start date. We'll call Monday. He slid it under Mrs. Peterson's door at the end of the hall, who would pass it to the building manager in the morning. Not elegant, not solved, but moving. The first week at Crosstech was orientation and shadow shifts, following a senior maintenance tech named Roy Castillo around the building while Roy explained systems, procedures, protocols, and the specific personalities of various pieces of aging equipment in a tone that suggested he'd been having the same arguments with these machines for a long time and had made a kind of peace with it. Roy was in his 50s, thick-armed, minimally talkative except when talking about the work, at which point he became specific and thorough in a way Ethan respected. He'd been with Crosstech for 11 years. He'd seen 3 facility managers come and go and had his own opinions about all of them, which he shared in the careful, non-inflammatory way of someone who'd learned to be diplomatic without being dishonest. "You know what separates a good maintenance guy from a bad one?" Roy said, on the second day while they were checking HVAC filters on the 7th floor. "Attention," Ethan said. Roy looked at him sideways. "I was going to say the same thing. Most guys wait to be told something's wrong. You're looking for it before it becomes wrong. The building talks, if you listen to it." Ethan pulled a filter out. It was filthy, significantly more than it should have been given the posted last change date. He held it up. Roy squinted at it. "That was supposed to be changed 6 weeks ago." According to the log. "Yeah." Roy pulled out his clipboard and made a note without being asked. "Si, Vokuma." "That's what I mean." Yes. Ethan learned the building the way he'd learned every building he'd ever worked in. Methodically, room by room, system by system, floor by floor. He had a small notebook he kept in his back pocket, and he wrote things in it, anomalies, things that had been fixed recently and might need follow-up, sequences and timing patterns he noticed in the HVAC behavior, a hinge in the 3rd floor conference room that was developing the same early-stage looseness he'd noticed on his first visit. Details that didn't come up in briefings because they hadn't become problems yet. He worked the overnight shift, which meant the building was mostly empty when he was there. Security, a few late working staff, the cleaning crew who ran their own schedule on floors 3 through 6. He got to know the security guard, Marcus, who worked the lobby desk and made excellent coffee and had strong opinions about the organization of the supply room on the lower level. He got to know the cleaning supervisor, a Filipino woman named Elena, who ran her crew with quiet authority and had been trying for 6 months to get a broken storage cart replaced. Ethan found the parts to fix the cart on his 3rd week during a Saturday shift, using components from the facility's supply closet and about 90 minutes of time that technically wasn't on his task list. He didn't ask for credit for it. He just left the fixed cart in the closet and told Elena it was done the next time he saw her. She looked at him for a second with the expression of someone trying to figure out the angle. "There's no angle," he said. "It was broken. I had the parts." She nodded once. That was the end of that. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the building had eyes in places he wasn't thinking about. Not surveillance in a sinister sense, simply the reality that Crosstech's CEO kept unusual hours and was known to walk the floors of her own building at odd times, and had developed, over years of running a company, the habit of noticing things about the people who worked for her that other executives never thought to observe. Ava Cross was 30 years old and had been running Crosstech for 3 years, and she had a particular quality that was both her greatest asset and occasionally her biggest problem. She was almost pathologically attentive, not in a performative way. She didn't walk the floors to be seen. She walked them because she'd found, early on, that you understood a company differently from the inside than you did from reports and dashboards. That numbers told you what had already happened, and people told you what was about to. She was on her way back from the 4th floor printer room at approximately 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday in Ethan's 3rd week, carrying a stack of documents she'd been reviewing and running slightly late on a call she needed to prep for, when she stopped in the hallway outside the server room because the door was open an inch and shouldn't have been. Inside, working by the light of his headlamp and a standing work lamp he'd brought from the supply closet, was the new overnight maintenance tech. He was replacing a bypass switch on one of the secondary cooling units, not an emergency repair, not on his assigned task list for the evening, and not something he'd been asked to do. He was doing it because he'd checked the maintenance log earlier in the week and noticed the switch had been flagged 2 months ago and never followed up on, and he'd sourced the replacement part on his own time. Ava stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't notice her. He was focused on his work with the kind of attention that came from actually caring about it, not just completing it. She stood there longer than she meant to. Then she moved on. She had, in her mental catalog of things she needed to investigate, added one item: find out more about Ethan Walker. She'd already done a standard new hire review of his file. She did this for all facilities staff, a habit from early in her tenure when she'd discovered that half the building's ongoing problems traced back to hiring patterns nobody was watching. His credentials were straightforward, work history consistent. The HVAC certification was real and had been validated. The 4-month employment gap had been noted and flagged as benign. But the name had done something the moment she'd first seen it on the application. She'd looked at it in her office, in the stack of new maintenance applicants that Dennis had sent up, and something had happened in her chest that she didn't immediately identify. Not a memory exactly. More like the approach of one. The feeling that something was orbiting the edge of what she could recall, not quite landing. Ethan Walker. She'd set the file down, picked up her coffee, gone back to the quarterly report she'd been reviewing. But the name had stayed with her, working quietly somewhere in the background, the way important things sometimes did when you weren't ready to look at them directly. It wasn't until 2 days later, driving home, that it surfaced. The rain had been coming down hard that night, 5 years ago, in a city that felt very different then, because she'd been very different. 25 years old, 18 months into a failed attempt to launch her own startup separate from her father's company, the attempt having collapsed that week in a very specific, humiliating way that involved 3 investors pulling out simultaneously and a co-founder she'd trusted more than she should have, taking the majority of what they'd built together and walking. She'd driven herself to a garage 2 miles from the office because her tire had gone flat on the shoulder, and she hadn't been able to change it herself in the dark and the rain and the particular fog that descended when everything you'd worked for and believed in fell apart in the span of 72 hours. The mechanic who'd changed her tire hadn't known any of that. He'd just been a guy working late, early 30s maybe, rain-soaked himself from the weather that came through the open bay door. He'd done the work without making her feel stupid for not knowing how to do it herself. And then, because she'd been sitting on a plastic chair in the waiting area with her head in her hands and clearly not okay, he'd sat down a few seats away with 2 bad coffees from the machine in the corner and set one down near her without asking. He hadn't pried, hadn't offered advice she hadn't asked for, had mostly just been present in the quiet way that some people managed when they understood that presence was the thing that was actually needed. At some point, she'd said something about starting over, that she didn't know if she had the energy for it, and he'd said she remembered it exactly because it was one of those things that arrived simply and without decoration and landed somewhere permanent. Starting over's not the hard part. The hard part is deciding you're worth starting over for. He'd refused to let her pay more than the standard rate for the tire change. She'd driven home, started over. 4 years later, she was running Crosstech and turning it into something her father had never quite managed. She'd never known his name. She'd tried, once, about 2 years after that night, to go back to the garage. It had closed. New business in the space, nobody who knew where the former owner had gone. She'd filed it in this category of things you let go of because the alternative was spending the rest of your life looking. And then his name had appeared on an application form on her desk. Ethan Walker. She'd told herself it was a common enough name, that the probability of it being the same person was low, that she was connecting dots that didn't necessarily belong to each other, but standing in the doorway of the server room watching him work, with the headlamp light catching the lines of his face and the careful, focused way he handled the tools, she'd known. She'd known with the kind of certainty that sits below argument, and she'd done nothing yet because she needed to think carefully about what doing something meant. Sophie's attack happened on a Thursday night, 5 weeks into Ethan's time at Crosstech. He was on shift, running a routine check on the 6th floor, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. Mrs. Navarro. He answered immediately because Mrs. Navarro never called during his shift unless it was necessary. "She's okay," Mrs. Navarro said first, which was the thing you said when you needed someone not to panic before you gave them the information. "But she woke up bad, Ethan. I've given her the rescue inhaler and she's breathing better, but she doesn't sound right. She's asking for you." He was already moving toward the elevator. He found Roy in the corridor and told him he had a family emergency. Roy, who had kids of his own and understood emergencies, told him to go, and he was out of the building in under 6 minutes. Sophie was sitting up in bed at Mrs. Navarro's apartment, pale and tired, with the particular exhausted stillness that came after the body had spent significant energy fighting for air. She had the inhaler on her lap, and Mrs. Navarro was sitting beside her with a hand on her back. "Hi, baby," Ethan said, crouching to her level. "Sorry," Sophie said, which broke something in him, that she would apologize. "Don't ever do that," he said. "Don't apologize for this. This is not your fault." "I woke Mrs. Navarro up." "That's what Mrs. Navarro is there for," Mrs. Navarro said firmly, from behind her. "I told him not to apologize either," she added to Ethan. "Neither of them listens." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Sophie, and she leaned against him with the full weight of a tired child who had been frightened and was now, finally, where she needed to be. He held her until she fell asleep. Then he sat in Mrs. Navarro's kitchen and drank the tea she put in front of him and thought about the medication Dr. Anand had recommended, about the copay that was still more than the budget could absorb, about the 60-day benefits window that was still 15 days away, about the air quality in their apartment and the mold in the bathroom wall, and the fact that he'd been managing for 4 years and managing wasn't the same as fixed, and the gap between those two things had never been more apparent than it was at 2 a.m. in a neighbor's kitchen with his daughter asleep down the hall. He called in late to the end of his shift to tell them he wouldn't be returning. Then he sat there a while longer. Dichat. He was back at work the following Monday early. Roy met him in the maintenance corridor with a look that asked without asking. "She's okay," Ethan said. "Better. I'm looking into the medication issue." Roy nodded. "Benefits kick in 2 weeks." "I know." "Good." Roy handed him the overnight log. "Second floor bathroom has a dripping faucet that's been dripping for apparently a month. It's yours." Ethan took the log and got to work. He fixed the faucet. He checked the HVAC sequence on 3 and 4 that had been cycling inconsistently. He repaired a loose threshold plate on the lobby entrance that he'd noticed on his way in. Technically exterior maintenance, technically not his department, but it was a tripping hazard and he had the tools and the 5 minutes. He worked the way he always worked, which was the way his father had worked before him, and his father's father before that. Not looking for recognition, not keeping score, just doing the thing that needed doing because it was there, and because work you did halfway was work you'd have to do twice. What he didn't know, still, was that it was being noticed. He didn't know that a quiet conversation had happened between Roy and Ava Cross in her office 2 weeks earlier, during which Roy had described the new overnight tech in terms that were specific and unambiguous. He didn't know that Ava had begun building a case, carefully, deliberately, for something she was preparing to offer. He didn't know that a file on her desk had been growing for 5 weeks with notes she'd made on his performance, on the unrequested repairs, on the fixed cart, on the uncovered error in the HVAC log that had saved the company a significant repair cost by catching the bypass switch before it failed entirely. He didn't know that the woman running the company he worked for had been waiting, for 5 years, for a way to do something about the stranger who had been kind to her on the worst night of her life. He just came in and did the work. And 2 weeks later, his daughter's benefits kicked in, and he called Dr. Anand's office and scheduled the appointment for the controller medication. And when he told Sophie about it that evening over dinner, that her breathing medicine was sorted, that the insurance was going to cover it, she put her fork down and looked at him with those dark eyes. "Told you," she said. "Told me what?" "That you'd figure it out." She picked her fork back up. "That's your thing." Ethan looked at his daughter, at the gap between her front teeth, at the crayon house with the red door, still taped to the wall beside the refrigerator where she'd put it 3 weeks ago. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." He didn't know, yet, that the hardest part wasn't behind them. That before things got better, he was going to have to fight for what he'd earned, and that a person he'd never thought to consider an enemy was already planning the first move. But that was coming. Tonight, Sophie was breathing clearly. That was enough. The controller medication changed things. Not dramatically, not overnight. Sophie's body needed time to adjust, and the first 2 weeks were uneven, with some mornings better than others, and one afternoon where she came home from school glassy-eyed and tired in a way that Dr. Anand said was normal, but that still sat badly with Ethan until it passed. But by the end of the 3rd week, he could tell the difference. She slept through the night without the shallow, effortful breathing he'd grown used to monitoring through the wall. She ran in the school hallway and didn't pay for it an hour later. The color in her face was better. She complained about the taste of the medication, which was somehow reassuring. A child complaining about something minor was a child who wasn't managing a crisis. "It tastes like the inside of a gym bag," Sophie told him on a Wednesday morning before school. "It works," he said. "Both things can be true." He looked at her. 8 years old. Her mother's syntax. "Yeah," he said. "Both things can be true." He rinsed her glass and set it in the rack and went back to making her lunch. Peanut butter and banana, no crust. The same lunch she'd eaten every day for approximately 2 years because she had decided this was the correct lunch and saw no reason to complicate things. The building manager, after Ethan had walked in with his Crosstech offer letter and a payment plan written out on notebook paper, had given him 60 days to clear the back rent. Not warm about it. Not friendly. But 60 days was 60 days. He'd paid the first installment already, and the second was coming out of this Friday's paycheck, and by the end of next month the balance would be gone. The eviction notice was still in his work folder. He kept it there deliberately, not as punishment, but as a record. But it had stopped being a countdown and started being a closed chapter. Their apartment was still their apartment, still small, still with the hissing radiator and the bathroom wall he'd complained about twice more without resolution. But it was theirs for now, and he was no longer doing the nightly math that had become as reflexive as breathing. That made room for him to notice other things, including the fact that Crosstech, at close range, was a more complicated place than it had looked from the outside. The maintenance team was 7 people across day, evening, and overnight shifts, plus Roy as senior tech and a facilities coordinator named Sandra, who sat in the office adjacent to the supply room and managed scheduling, procurement, and the internal ticketing system. They were generally a functional group, not social, not particularly close, but professionally competent and largely unbothered by each other, which in Ethan's experience was actually the ideal conditions for a maintenance crew. Drama was expensive when the building had plumbing. The complications came from elsewhere in the building. In his first month, Ethan had mostly stayed below the organizational waterline. Maintenance lived in the lower floors, in the back corridors and utility rooms that nobody thought about unless something stopped working. He did his job. He was polite to everyone he encountered. He learned which departments kept late hours and which ones left at exactly 5. He got a general sense of the personalities on each floor without trying to, because maintenance was invisible in a specific way that made people behave as if you weren't there. The HR department was on the second floor, Suite 204, a corridor of glass-walled offices and an open workspace where the coordinators sat. The department head was a man named Gerald Sims, who had been with Crosstech for 6 years and who had, by all available evidence, developed significant opinions about the organizational hierarchy and his position within it. Ethan had fixed a light fixture in the hallway outside Gerald's office in his second week and formed an impression in the approximate 20 minutes that it took. A man in his late 40s with the careful dress and practiced affect of someone who thought more about how he appeared than about what he was actually doing. He'd passed Ethan in the corridor without acknowledgement, which was fine. Not everyone acknowledged maintenance staff, and Ethan didn't require it. But there was something in the quality of the non-acknowledgement, a slight performance to it, that registered. The one who was actually a problem was not Gerald himself, but a coordinator under him named Kevin Marsh. Kevin was 29, according to the roster Ethan had briefly seen in Sandra's office. He had the particular energy of someone who'd decided early on that institutional rules were meant to create leverage for the people who knew how to use them, and had organized his career around that principle. He managed onboarding documentation and new hire records, which meant he had access to personnel files and a reason to interact with new employees in their first weeks. He'd come down to the maintenance corridor twice in Ethan's first month, both times with minor requests dressed as routine queries, confirming a schedule, asking about a parts requisition that turned out to be nothing, and both times Ethan had felt, without being able to fully articulate why, that the purpose of the visits was observation rather than information. The third visit was different. It was a Friday, late in Ethan's 5th week. He was in the supply room doing an end-of-week inventory, a task he'd taken over from Roy not because anyone asked him to, but because he'd noticed the inventory had been running inconsistently and it cost the department money when they ordered parts they already had. Kevin appeared in the doorway with a folder. "Walker," he said. "Yeah." Ethan didn't stop counting. "I need to clarify something on your onboarding forms. There's a discrepancy in your employment history documentation." Ethan set down the clipboard. "What discrepancy?" Kevin opened the folder. He held it at an angle that was just slightly difficult to read straight on. "The dates on your warehouse employment don't match what we have on file from the reference check." "The warehouse ran short weeks from October through January," Ethan said. "That might be what you're seeing. Reduced hours aren't a gap in employment. The system flags it as a gap. Then the system needs a note." Ethan looked at him evenly. "What do you need from me to fix it?" Kevin wrote something in the folder. "I may need you to come to HR and fill out a correction form." "Fine. When?" "I'll let you know." Kevin closed the folder. "These things can take a while to resolve. You're still in your probationary period." He said the last sentence with the particular inflection of someone who wanted you to hear the implication without being able to accuse them of saying it out loud. Ethan looked at him for a second. "Okay," he said. "Let me know when you need me." Kevin left. Ethan turned back to the inventory and finished counting, and then he sat down on a storage crate and thought carefully about what had just happened. He'd been in enough workplaces to recognize the shape of it. Kevin Marsh had access to his file, a process-adjacent reason to poke at it, and the kind of territorial instinct that some people developed when they perceived a new arrival as occupying space that threatened them somehow. Ethan couldn't yet figure out what specifically he was threatening. He was an overnight maintenance tech, as far removed from Kevin's HR corridor as you could get in the same building. But the feeling was there, clear as a bad bearing in a motor. He wasn't going to do anything about it yet. He was going to do his job and watch. 2 days after the supply room visit, one of the senior engineers on the 4th floor, a woman named Joanna Park, flagged an issue with the automated ventilation controls in the East Wing. The controls had been behaving erratically, cycling on and off in patterns that didn't match the program's schedule, and 2 engineers had already complained about the temperature fluctuations affecting their equipment calibrations. Roy assigned it to Ethan because Roy had a backlog on the 6th floor cooling system, and Ethan had demonstrated by this point enough facility with HVAC mechanics that Roy trusted him with something more complex than a filter replacement. Ethan spent 3 hours on it. He went through the control panel logs first, identified a pattern in the erratic cycling that pointed toward a sensor calibration issue rather than a programming fault, recalibrated the sensors, ran a test sequence, watched the system respond correctly, and then spent another 40 minutes cross-referencing the maintenance logs to figure out why the sensors had drifted in the first place. The answer was that someone had run a cleaning spray near the intake panel 6 weeks ago and introduced a residue that had thrown the sensitivity calibration off by a margin that was small enough to seem like noise at first but compounded over time. He wrote it up in the maintenance log in detail: cause, diagnosis, repair, preventive note for future, and filed it with Sandra. Roy read it at the end of the shift. "You logged the cause," Roy said. "It'll happen again if nobody knows to watch for it." Roy made a sound that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement, but was somewhere in that region. He was a man who expressed respect through tasks rather than words. The next morning, he assigned Ethan the full East Wing HVAC responsibility, which in maintenance terms was a promotion. Joanna Park found Ethan in the corridor the following day and said, "Thank you, that was driving us insane." It was quick and practical, not effusive, and Ethan appreciated both things. What he didn't know was that Roy had mentioned the sensor write-up to someone in passing, and that the someone had passed it further, and that it had eventually reached the 32nd floor where it sat in a file that was already accumulating similar items. The relationship between Ethan and Roy settled into something functional and occasionally almost warm over those weeks. They weren't friends. The gap in age and the difference in their baseline personalities kept a certain professional distance. But Roy was a man who respected competence without needing to make a speech about it, and Ethan was a man who didn't need speeches, so they suited each other. Roy had a daughter too, 17, applying to colleges, costing him money and sleep in approximately equal measure. He mentioned her in the practical, slightly overwhelmed way that parents mention teenagers, with love, but also the specific bewilderment of someone who remembered the child as smaller and simpler and couldn't quite track how this complicated current version had developed so quickly. "She wants to go to school out of state," Roy said one night, on their way back from a late-running repair job on the 5th floor. "Does she have a plan for what she wants to study?" "She wants to study marine biology." He said it with a tone that was not dismissive, but carried a note of baffled resignation, like a man who'd expected accounting and was still adjusting. "Marine biology's a real field," Ethan said. "I know it's a real field." Roy was quiet for a second. "I just don't know what you do with it afterward." "Research, conservation, field work. There are companies that do marine resource assessment. It's not narrow." Roy looked at him. "How do you know that?" Ethan shrugged. "My wife wanted to be a marine biologist before nursing school." Roy didn't say anything for a moment. "I didn't know that." "No reason you would." They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, which was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable but had some weight to it, the particular gravity of information shared between people who didn't share much. "She was a nurse?" Roy asked at the stairwell door. "Yeah." Roy nodded. He held the door. They went back to work. After that, something shifted slightly between them. Still professional, still not friends exactly. But Roy started checking in about Sophie occasionally, brief, unpressured, just a nod in the direction of the fact that he knew Ethan was managing something outside these walls. And Ethan received it for what it was. Chat. Kevin Marsh's second move came 3 weeks after the first. It arrived in the form of a formal HR notice, delivered through Sandra's office. A written flag on Ethan's record noting that his submitted overtime hours for the week of the East Wing HVAC repair were inconsistent with documented task completion times and required review. Ethan read it twice. Then he went to Sandra. Sandra had been with the company for 9 years, had survived 3 management restructurings, and had developed the perfectly calibrated neutrality of a person who'd seen enough to form private opinions about everything but express them in official channels about almost nothing. She looked at the notice when he laid it on her desk. Then she looked up. "Do you have your log entries for that week?" she asked. "I have everything." He set his notebook on the desk. the one he kept in his back pocket, with the dates and times and task descriptions written in his handwriting. I clocked in and out through the system, but I also logged manually. Habit. She looked through the notebook for about a minute. The times match. I know they do. She looked at him. There was something behind her eyes that was more than bureaucratic neutrality, but she kept it controlled. I'll note that the discrepancy has been reviewed and resolved. The flag will be cleared. Who filed the flag? He asked. She was quiet for a second. That's internal HR process. He hadn't expected her to answer. He'd asked because he wanted her to know that he knew, and he thought she understood that. Thanks, Sandra, he said. Keep your notebook, she said. It was the most loaded piece of practical advice he'd received in months. He left. He wasn't rattled, exactly. He'd dealt with institutional friction before, say, the warehouse had its own version of it, petty and local and exhausting. But there was something more deliberate about this that he needed to think through carefully. Whoever was pushing on these threads was patient enough to use legitimate-looking processes. That meant it wasn't going to stop on its own. He called Mrs. Navarro that night to check on Sophie, who was at home with her because Ethan's shift ended at 5 a.m., and Sophie's school day started at 8, and the window required coverage. Sophie was fine. She'd made a paper frog at school and was trying to figure out if it could be made to actually jump with rubber bands, which sounded dangerous in a way that was also exactly what an 8-year-old should be doing. She's okay, Mrs. Navarro said. Stop worrying. I'm not worrying, Ethan said. You called to check. That's not worrying, that's confirming. Mrs. Navarro made a sound that communicated her opinion of that distinction clearly, and then they said goodnight. He sat in his car in the parking garage for a few minutes before driving home. He thought about Kevin Marsh. He thought about what the man was actually trying to accomplish. Because it wasn't personal, couldn't be personal, not with someone who barely knew him. It was territorial in some way he hadn't fully mapped yet, and territory implied something being protected or contested. He needed to be careful. He needed to keep his documentation clean and his conduct unimpeachable, and not react to anything that could be reframed as a problem. He knew how these things worked. The person being targeted didn't need to have done anything wrong. They just needed to make one mistake in response. He drove home. He didn't make any mistakes. God. The building had a small roof access area on the 14th floor. Technically, not the roof, but a ventilation maintenance level, accessed through a locked corridor with a partial view of the city on the east side. Ethan had been up there twice for work to check on an exhaust system that was underperforming. The second time, it had been a clear night, and he'd spent about 4 minutes looking out at the city before going back down, which was 4 minutes more than his task required. He didn't think much about it until he came up again, 6 weeks into the job, to run a follow-up check on the exhaust system, and found the corridor door propped open, a small wooden wedge, barely noticeable, tucked at the base. He removed the wedge, checked the area, found nothing concerning, logged it as a security note in his report. Propped doors on access corridors were a protocol violation, minor, but worth noting. 2 nights later, he came back to do a scheduled maintenance pull on the exhaust unit, and the wedge was back. He removed it again, said nothing, logged it again. The third time, he came up slightly earlier than scheduled and found the door open and Ava Cross standing at the far end of the ventilation level, looking out at the city with her jacket on and her hands wrapped around a coffee thermos. She heard him before she saw him, turned. There was a moment, probably a second, maybe less, where they both processed the situation. A CEO and the overnight maintenance tech, meeting unexpectedly in a place neither of them was particularly supposed to be after midnight. Ethan spoke first. I keep finding this door wedged open. I've been logging it. I know, she said. I've seen the logs. She paused. That's mine. The wedge. I come up here sometimes. I should have cleared it with facilities. I'll note that it's authorized, he said, because that was the relevant practical information. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back out at the city. It was a clear night. The light spread out below them in the particular way city light did from a height. Not beautiful in a magazine sense, more just large and breathing, the accumulated evidence of a lot of people living their lives simultaneously. He stood for a second in the doorway, holding his work bag. He had the exhaust unit to check. Walker? She said, not looking at him. How long have you been with us? 6 weeks tomorrow. And the sensor recalibration on 4, the overtime flag, the cart in the cleaning supply room. She said these like items being read from a list. The threshold plate in the lobby. The HVAC log discrepancy from week 2. He was quiet for a moment. Roy must have mentioned some of that. Roy mentioned one thing. The rest I found on my own. She turned toward him. In the overhead light, she looked younger than he'd expected. He'd formed an impression of her from a distance and from Roy's description, and neither fully matched the person standing in front of him. She was direct in a way that wasn't aggressive but didn't have any softness designed to manage him either. You do work that isn't on your list. If something needs doing and I can do it, I do it. A lot of people have that principle until it costs them time. Then they didn't really have the principle, he said. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Something moved through her expression that was hard to read. Not nothing, but not readable to him yet. Get your check done, she said, turning back to the city. Don't let me hold you up. He went to check the exhaust unit. When he came back through the corridor 12 minutes later, she was gone, and the door was closed. Kevin's third move was less subtle. It came in the form of a meeting request to Sandra, officially initiated through HR, technically framed as a probationary period review, and scheduled for a Friday afternoon when Roy had told Ethan he'd be on a day shift covering for one of the day crew absences. Ethan saw the meeting request when Sandra forwarded it with the same careful neutrality she'd applied to the overtime flag. He read it. The framing cited ongoing documentation inconsistencies and conduct concerns that had not previously been communicated to him through any official channel. He sat with this for about 20 minutes. Then he went to Sandra's office and asked, without preamble, whether there was a specific documented instance of conduct concern that he should be aware of before the meeting. Sandra looked at her computer screen. There is a report, she said, filed last week, noting that you had accessed a restricted corridor on the 14th floor without prior authorization. He looked at her. I have a documented maintenance reason for every visit to that level, all logged. I know, she said, in the same flat tone she always used, except this time there was something underneath it, a kind of thread of controlled frustration that she was managing carefully. Sandra, he said, I need to know whether this is something I should be talking to someone about. She looked at him. Just for a second, the neutrality cracked enough to let something through. Not anger, but decision. The CEO's office schedules its own direct communication, she said. That's not my department. It was a sentence she had no reason to say in response to what he'd asked. He understood it perfectly. Thanks, he said. He went back to the maintenance corridor. He sat down on the storage crate where he'd sat after Kevin's first visit, and he thought about what Sandra had just told him without technically telling him anything. He thought about the conversation on the 14th floor, about Ava Cross listing tasks he'd done with the specific cadence of someone who'd been paying attention for a while. About the way she'd looked at him, not like a manager reviewing an employee, but like someone working through a longer and more complicated thought. He didn't know what it meant yet, but it was clear that something was happening at a level above his sight line, and that it was moving faster now than it had been. Kevin's Friday meeting was still on the calendar. Ethan wasn't going to try to derail it. He wasn't going to call in favors he didn't have. He was going to walk in with his logbook and his documented history and his clear record and let the work speak for itself, the way it always had, because that was the only language he'd ever found reliable. He pulled out the logbook and opened it to the current week. There were 12 entries since Monday, every hour accounted for, every task described, every deviation from the standard list documented with the reason, the time, and the outcome. He read through it once, the way you read something you'd written to check whether it was honest, not just accurate. It was both. He closed the logbook and put it back in his pocket. 2 floors up, Roy was replacing a pump seal on the 6th floor cooling system and trying to decide whether his daughter's marine biology ambition was something he should be fighting or funding. On the 32nd floor, Ava Cross was in a meeting that was running long and watching the clock in the particular way of someone with somewhere more important to be. And somewhere in the 2nd floor HR suite, Kevin Marsh was working on a document he believed was going to accomplish something. The building went on around all of them, indifferent and mechanical, leaking heat and circulating air and doing what buildings did. Ethan Walker sat in the maintenance corridor with his logbook in his pocket and waited for Friday. Friday came the way bad Fridays usually did. Not dramatically, just steadily. The way weather moves in from the west when you've already seen it on the radar and there's nothing to do but wait. Ethan came in for his day shift coverage at 7 in the morning and spent the first 3 hours doing ordinary work: a malfunctioning water heater on the second floor, a light panel on 6 that had been flickering since Wednesday, a drainage issue in the 4th floor bathroom that turned out to be a clogged trap and took 8 minutes once he got to it. He worked with the focused steadiness he always worked with, and nobody watching him would have known that at 2 o'clock that afternoon there was a meeting scheduled in HR that had been designed, as far as he could determine, to create a paper trail with enough weight to push him out. Roy was on the 6th floor for most of the morning. He came down around 11 with grease on his forearm and the look of a man who'd spent 3 hours arguing with a machine and had come out slightly ahead. "Meeting still on?" Roy asked, not looking at him, refilling his water bottle at the corridor sink. 2 o'clock, Ethan said. Roy screwed the cap on the bottle. He turned it in his hand once. "You've got your logs." "All of them." Roy nodded like that settled something, then went back upstairs. That was the extent of the conversation, and it was exactly the right amount. Roy wasn't a man who made speeches about things he couldn't change, and Ethan didn't need a speech. He needed to know that someone in the building knew what was happening and had looked at the situation without flinching. That was what Roy had given him. He ate lunch in the maintenance corridor, a sandwich he'd made at home, a thermos of coffee, and went over his logbook one more time, not because he needed to check anything, but because the act of reading his own documentation settled something in him. Every hour, every task, every deviation from the standard list with the full reason. 12 weeks of consistent, clean record. He closed the book and put it in his bag and went upstairs at 1:50. The HR suite was different during daytime hours, occupied, humming with the specific energy of people managing processes. He checked in with the coordinator at the front desk, who told him to take a seat. He sat. He was the calmest person in the room, which was not a performance. He was calm because he'd done nothing wrong, and in his experience, doing nothing wrong was the most useful thing you could bring into a room where someone was trying to argue otherwise. Gerald Sims came out first. Gerald was wearing a tie that was slightly too formal for a Friday afternoon in a facilities context, which told Ethan something about how Gerald thought about this meeting. He extended a hand and shook Ethan's with the careful professionalism of a man who'd been in HR long enough to understand that every interaction was potentially documentable. "Thanks for coming in," Gerald said. "Of course," Ethan said. Kevin Marsh was already in the conference room, seated at the side of the table with a neat stack of papers in front of him and the specific composure of someone who'd rehearsed this. He didn't stand when Ethan entered. He looked up and nodded once, and Ethan nodded back without anything extra in it. Gerald sat at the head of the table. Ethan sat across from Kevin. "This is a standard probationary review," Gerald began. "We conduct these at the 60-day mark for new maintenance personnel." Ethan said nothing, because that sentence had technically been true, and he was going to let the conversation find its own shape before responding to any of it. "There have been a few items flagged during the review period that we wanted to discuss." Gerald opened his own folder. Employment documentation inconsistencies, overtime irregularities, access to restricted building areas. The employment documentation was reviewed and cleared by Sandra Reyes 3 weeks ago, Ethan said. He kept his voice level. "She confirmed the dates matched my manual logs. Do you want me to provide those again?" Gerald looked at Kevin briefly, which was information. "We have Sandra's note," Gerald said. "The overtime flag was also reviewed and cleared. Same source, same week." Ethan set his logbook on the table. "My logs document every hour, every task, and every variance. I log manually as a habit. These go back to my first day." Kevin leaned forward slightly. "The volume of off-list work is itself a concern. Work completed outside of assigned task parameters creates liability exposure. Fixing a tripping hazard on the lobby threshold creates liability," Ethan said. "Not fixing it is the liability." He kept his eyes on Kevin, not hostile, just direct. "I can walk you through each item." The cart repair was done with surplus parts on a shift when my assigned tasks were complete. The sensor recalibration was assigned by Roy Castillo. The HVAC log cross-reference was logged as a root cause analysis and saved the department a repair estimate of, he glanced at his notebook, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, according to the contractor quote Sandra pulled. That's also in the records. Kevin's expression didn't change much, but something around the eyes tightened very slightly. The 14th floor access, Kevin started, is documented in my maintenance logs with timestamps and task descriptions every time I was on that level. Ethan looked at Gerald. Is there a specific date you're questioning? Gerald shifted in his seat. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand that the meeting was not going the way it had been framed for him. The concern, Kevin said, with the measured patience of someone recalibrating, is a pattern. Individually, these items may be explainable, but the cumulative picture raises questions about whether the role— What questions specifically? Ethan asked. Kevin stopped. I'm not trying to be difficult, Ethan said, and he meant it. He genuinely wasn't. He was just asking the question that the whole conversation had been circling without answering. If there's a specific conduct concern, I want to understand it and address it. If there's a task parameter I've misunderstood, tell me and I'll correct it. But if the concern is that I do more work than I'm assigned to do, I'd need someone to explain how that constitutes a problem, because I've been working in maintenance for 4 years and I've never had that conversation before. The room was quiet for a few seconds. Gerald cleared his throat. He shuffled his folder closed in a way that was different from how he'd opened it. We'll review the documentation you've provided. We'll be in touch regarding the outcome of the review. Ethan picked up his logbook. He stood. He looked at Kevin Marsh one more time, not with anger, but with the clear, simple acknowledgement of someone who'd seen what he was looking at and was not going to pretend otherwise. I'm on shift until 5, Ethan said to Gerald, if you need anything else. He left. He didn't go directly back to the maintenance corridor. He took the long way, through the lobby, past the threshold plate he'd fixed in week 3, around to the east entrance, up the back stairwell to the second floor, where he stopped in the small landing by the window for about 3 minutes and let himself feel what he'd been managing for 2 hours. Not anger exactly. Anger was there, but it was familiar and manageable. The kind of anger that came from being treated as less than what he was. What was harder was the secondary thing underneath it. The fatigue. The specific exhaustion of being a person who did good work and still had to spend energy defending it. He'd been doing that for 4 years in one form or another, fighting uphill against circumstances that kept shifting, and most of the time he could carry it because the work itself was steady and the work was his. But there were moments when the weight of it found a way through. He stood in the stairwell and breathed for 3 minutes. Then he went back to work. Roy was waiting for him in the maintenance corridor when he came down at 3:30. Roy never waited for him. Roy was not a waiting kind of person. His being there, standing outside the supply room with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was carefully arranged into neutrality, was its own announcement. How'd it go? Roy asked. It went, Ethan said. Kevin ran it? Gerald ran it. Kevin had the papers. Roy made a sound in the back of his throat that was not a word but carried a specific meaning. He'd been at this company long enough to have formed thorough opinions about Kevin Marsh, and had apparently decided today was close enough to an emergency to partially express them. Gerald's not the problem, Roy said. He's not smart enough to be the problem. He does what the paperwork tells him. I know. Ethan set his bag down and started pulling out his afternoon task list. It's over for now. They'll review the documentation and there's nothing there that holds. Kevin knows it. He's fishing. For what? Ethan thought about this. I'm not sure yet. I think he needs one actual mistake. Something he can build on. Roy looked at him. You going to give him one? No. Roy nodded like that was the end of the conversation and went back to his work. Sophie called him at 4:15 from Mrs. Navarro's phone. She wasn't old enough for her own, a fact she had opinions about. Dad, can I have a rabbit? He was in the middle of a pump inspection. No. Why not? Because we live in an apartment with bad air quality, and I already have one dependent. A rabbit isn't a dependent. Everything alive is a dependent. He checked the pressure reading. Did Mrs. Navarro say you could have a rabbit? She said I should ask you. Smart woman. Dad? Sophie? There was a pause on her end, which was a negotiating pause. He recognized the architecture of it, because she'd been running this kind of conversation since she was about 6 and had gotten increasingly sophisticated. What if it was a small rabbit, she said. The size of the rabbit is not the relevant variable. What if I researched rabbits and made a presentation? He stopped. He looked at the pump. He thought about his 8-year-old offering to prepare formal arguments in favor of a pet. I'm not negotiating rabbit logistics at 4:15 on a workday, he said. When can we negotiate rabbit logistics? Never. That's not a time. He finished the pressure check. He wrote the number in his log. Eat your dinner and do your homework. I'll be home by 6:30. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh, but in the general family. Is your breathing okay? He asked, because he always asked. Fine, she said. Better than fine. I ran at recess and didn't have to stop. Something loosened in his chest at that. Good. That's really good. The medication's working. Yeah, he said. It is. Even if it tastes like the inside of a gym bag. Even if, he agreed. He finished his shift and drove home. The following 2 weeks had a specific texture to them. Not quiet, not tense, exactly, but charged in the way that periods between actions were charged when you knew something was still in motion but couldn't yet see where it was moving. Kevin didn't stop. He was careful about it. Careful enough that Ethan couldn't point to anything concrete as escalation. But the attention was there, a background presence, like something running in a low hum just outside the frequency you could fully locate. Small things. A work order that was misrouted and arrived late to Ethan's queue, leaving him scrambling to complete it within shift. A building access log discrepancy that turned out to be a system glitch, but generated an internal query that required Sandra's time to resolve. Nothing individually catastrophic, nothing that stuck, but each one required Ethan's energy to address. And that was probably the point. Not to land a decisive blow, but to wear the edges down, to accumulate small friction until something gave. Ethan kept his logbook current. He kept his conduct clean. He spoke to Roy about anything that felt even slightly ambiguous. He was, in every measurable respect, exactly the employee he'd been since day one, and he'd been doing this long enough to understand that consistency was its own form of argument. Sandra had started flagging things for him before they became formal. A word here, a note there, always framed as administrative process, and never as anything that could be construed as her taking a side. But the pattern of it was clear enough to Ethan, and he appreciated it in the way you appreciated someone doing something that cost them something, even if you could never acknowledge it directly. What he didn't have any visibility into was the 32nd floor. Ava Cross had been watching the situation develop for 2 weeks with the focused attention of a person who was very good at seeing things that were still in motion and who had strong feelings about a specific kind of institutional behavior. She'd seen Kevin Marsh's game before. Not Kevin specifically, but the pattern. HR-adjacent personnel with process access using documentation leverage to target someone they'd decided was a problem, for reasons that had nothing to do with performance. It was a particular kind of workplace predation, insidious because it operated inside legitimate channels and could look like diligence to someone who wasn't watching closely. She was watching closely. She had Ethan Walker's complete file on her desk, which she'd pulled 2 weeks ago and reviewed herself rather than delegating. She'd gone through the maintenance logs, the overtime records, the corrected documentation flags, the 14th floor access reports. She'd read Roy's informal performance notes, which Roy hadn't known he was writing for her benefit. He wrote them for himself, a habit from years of supervising union workers where documentation was survival. She'd read Sandra's carefully neutral administrative records, which, to someone who could read between the lines, told a story that was not neutral at all. And she'd had one conversation with Ethan herself, on the ventilation level at midnight, which had told her more in 12 minutes than any of the paperwork. He'd said, "If something needs doing and I can do it, I do it. And when she'd pushed back, then they didn't really have the principal. She sat with that for a while. She'd been running Crosstech for 3 years, and she'd hired a lot of people and fired some of them and promoted others and made mistakes on all 3 fronts. She'd gotten better at reading people over that time, not infallible, but better. The thing she'd learned to trust was not first impressions, but consistency. The degree to which a person behaved the same way, whether they thought they were being watched or not. The threshold plate in the lobby had been fixed at 6 a.m. when the building was empty. The cart repair had been done on a slow Saturday. The sensor write-up had been detailed and specific and had included the preventive note that nobody asked for, which meant it had been written for the building's benefit, not for any particular audience. Ethan Walker had been performing the same way since day one, in front of nobody. She'd known who he was for almost 2 months now. She'd been carrying that knowledge and working through what it meant, what the right thing to do with it was. The ethical dimensions were not simple. She was the CEO, he was an overnight maintenance tech, and the gulf between those positions created complications that she took seriously. She wasn't going to use her position to give him something he hadn't earned. She'd decided that clearly, early on. But what she was watching Kevin Marsh try to do to a person who had earned what he had, that she was not going to leave alone. She picked up her phone. Not that. Ethan was in the server room on 12 when his supervisor's tablet pinged. Not his personal phone, the work tablet he carried during day shifts for maintenance orders. The ping was a calendar notification, which shouldn't have been on his maintenance tablet because maintenance workers didn't have company calendar access. He looked at it. Walker. My office. Monday, 9 a.m. A cross. He read it twice. He looked at the tablet like it might correct itself. It didn't. He put it in his bag and finished the server room inspection and went back to the corridor and stood there for a minute with his hand on the wall, thinking. He didn't know what it meant. He'd been trying not to speculate about the CEO since the ventilation level conversation, keeping it in a specific compartment where he put things that were outside his control and therefore not worth expending energy on. But this was not easy to keep in a compartment. This was a direct summons to the 32nd floor. He didn't tell Roy. He wasn't sure what he'd say. He went home, made dinner, helped Sophie with her math homework. She was working on 2-digit multiplication, which she found infuriating in the way she found most things that didn't come immediately. He sat with her through the frustration, which was the main task, because the math itself was simple enough once she stopped being angry at it. I don't understand why the order matters, she said, glaring at the worksheet. 6 times 7 and 7 times 6 give you the same answer, he said. So in a sense, the order doesn't matter. Then why do they teach it? Because you need to be able to do it in both orders when you're working with bigger numbers. The pattern matters, even if the specific result is the same. She looked at him. That's actually helpful. Occasionally I'm helpful, he said. She went back to the worksheet. He watched her work. The small crease between her eyebrows when she was concentrating, the way she mouthed numbers under her breath. She'd started the year below grade level in math and had climbed back to where she should be through a combination of stubbornness and the fact that she genuinely disliked being bad at things. Not competitive in a social way, just in the internal way, the way some people were built. He thought about Monday morning. He thought about Ava Cross and what she could possibly want. He got Sophie to bed, cleaned up the kitchen, and sat at the table for a while with his coffee going cold and his logbook open in front of him. Not reading it this time, just having it there. Monday arrived with the flat gray light of a November morning that was trying to decide whether to rain. Ethan was at the Crosstech building at 8:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than required and exactly the kind of thing he couldn't help doing. He told the lobby security desk he had a 9 o'clock with Ms. Cross's office. They confirmed it, gave him a visitor badge for the 32nd floor, and directed him to the executive elevator. The 32nd floor was a different building than the one he worked in. Not ostentatious, Crosstech's aesthetic was functional in a way that money had made very refined, all clean lines and materials that looked simple and cost a lot. But the quality of the quiet up there was different. The air itself felt different, the way pressure changed with altitude even if you couldn't feel it directly. The executive assistant, a young woman who introduced herself as Diane, brought him into a waiting area and offered him water. He took it because he needed something to do with his hands. He waited 11 minutes. Then Diane appeared in the doorway and nodded once. Ava Cross's office had one large window behind the desk that looked out over the east side of the city, which was currently gray and overcast and entirely indifferent to anyone's professional situation. She was standing when he came in, not behind the desk but beside it, which he registered. She gestured to the chairs arranged around a low table in the corner of the room, away from the desk, less formal. He sat. She sat. She looked the same as she had on the 14th floor. Direct, contained, younger than the title would have suggested if you hadn't already adjusted your expectations. "I want to tell you something," she said without preamble, "and I want to ask you to let me finish before you respond, because I've thought about how to do this for a while and I'd rather get through it cleanly." He set his water down. "Okay." She looked at him steadily. 5 years ago. A garage on the south side of the city, late October, night with heavy rain. You were working a late shift. A woman came in with a flat tire who was not okay. He went very still. The memory was not sharp exactly. It was one of dozens of similar nights from years of garage work, a lot of late customers in a lot of weather. But something in the specific combination of details, the rain, October, a woman who was not okay, found a thread. "You changed her tire," Ava said. "You also made her sit down and drink bad coffee, and you said something to her that she's thought about more times than she can count." She paused. "I was 25. My startup had collapsed that week. I'd lost the co-founder and most of the capital, and I didn't know if I had anything left to rebuild from." Ethan looked at her. He was processing several things at once and doing it slowly, the way you process something that was rearranging the architecture of a room you thought you understood. "You said, starting over isn't the hard part. The hard part is deciding you're worth starting over for." He remembered. Not the face. He hadn't known her face. But the night, yes. The rain coming in through the bay door, the woman in the waiting area with her head in her hands who was clearly carrying something much heavier than a flat tire. "I went back to that garage 2 years later," she said. "It was closed." "I left the year after," he said. His voice came out quietly. "The owner sold. I moved to warehouse work." She nodded. Like that answered something she'd been wondering about. "I saw your name on the application, and I didn't know for certain. Not until I saw you on 4, the ventilation level. Then I was sure." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. "What I'm about to tell you is not because of that night. It's not gratitude being dressed up as merit. Those are different things, and I know the difference, and I won't insult you by blurring them." She meant it. It was in the quality of how she said it, direct and without softness designed to make it easier to receive. "I've been watching your work since week 2. Roy's notes, Sandra's records, the logs you keep that nobody asked you to keep, the parts you sourced on your own time, the work order documentation that caught the bypass fault before it became a 6-figure repair." She stopped. Then, "You've been doing the job of a facilities operations manager since week 3. You just haven't had the title or the pay." He looked at her. Something was happening in his chest that was large and complicated and not ready to be named yet. "There's a position," she said. "Facilities operations manager. It's been open for 4 months because I haven't found the right person. Full oversight of building maintenance, systems management, contractor coordination. Salary that's 3 times what you're making. Full benefits, the good plan. Long-term contract." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, at the gray city outside, and then back at her. "What about Kevin Marsh?" he said. Something shifted in her expression. "What about him?" "He's been building a file on me for 2 months. If I walk into a management role, that file becomes a problem." He said it flatly, not as a complaint, just as the practical landscape. "Gerald runs what Kevin gives him. There are 3 open queries on my record right now that aren't resolved." "I know about Kevin," she said. "Do you know why?" She paused. "I have a theory. Tell me yours." "He wanted the facilities manager role," Ethan said. "Not because he's qualified for it. He's HR, not facilities. But he's been here 6 years, and he believes seniority entitles him to something. And when he saw external applicants being considered, he started looking for ways to influence the pool. He held her gaze. I was the easiest target. Night shift, single father, financial stress in my background. He thought I'd crack under the pressure or make a mistake. Ava looked at him for a moment. That's not a theory, she said. That's an assessment. Am I wrong? No. She let that sit for a second. The Kevin situation will be addressed, separately through the appropriate process with appropriate documentation. You won't need to do anything except be willing to provide your logs if requested. She looked at him directly. I won't ask you to trust that without earning it. But I'm telling you clearly, the queries on your record will be cleared and the conduct review will be closed before you start the new role. That's not a favor. That's basic function. He sat with all of this. He was a man who'd learned to be careful about doors that opened. In his experience, they sometimes opened onto something else unexpected. And the appropriate response to a good offer was not immediate gratitude, but clear-eyed evaluation. He also knew when something was exactly what it presented itself as being. I need to think about it, he said. She nodded. No pushback. You have until Wednesday. He stood. She stood. They were approximately the same height, which he hadn't quite registered before. I need to ask you something, he said, and I'm asking it because I'd rather know than not know. Ask. If that night hadn't happened, if I was just the overnight maintenance tech with a clean record and a good logbook, would this conversation be happening? She didn't look away. Honestly, maybe not this fast. You'd have had to stay longer for the pattern to become visible at this level. She paused. But the pattern would have become visible. It always does with people who work the way you work. She held his gaze. The answer to your question is yes, eventually. The night didn't create the reason. It just made me look sooner. He thought about that. He thought it was probably the most honest answer she could have given, and the fact that it wasn't a simple yes told him something about the quality of her honesty. Wednesday, he said. Wednesday, she agreed. He picked up his water glass. He put it back down. He walked out through the office, past Diane's desk, and into the elevator, and stood in it alone for the 32 floors back to his level, with his hand flat against the wall and his eyes closed, breathing. He had a logbook in his bag and a conversation in his head, and somewhere across the city his daughter was at school running at recess without having to stop. He needed to think. He had until Wednesday. He didn't tell anyone that night. He drove home through the gray afternoon with the heater running and the radio off, and the specific silence of a person who had too much to process to also have noise. He stopped at the grocery store out of habit. They needed milk, and Sophie had asked for apples 2 days ago, and he'd forgotten. And walked the aisles with a basket and the particular detached quality of someone whose body was doing one thing while their mind was somewhere else entirely. He stood in front of the Apple display for approximately 45 seconds longer than necessary before putting 4 in the basket and moving on. At home, Sophie was already there. Mrs. Navarro dropped her off on Mondays, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread in front of her and a glass of juice and the focused, slightly combative expression she brought to subjects she hadn't decided to like yet. Today it was a reading comprehension worksheet that appeared to have personally offended her. This passage doesn't make sense, she said without looking up when Ethan came in. Show me, she pointed. He read the passage. It was about weather patterns, written in the specific airless prose of elementary school textbooks that managed to make interesting subjects feel like documentation. It's asking what causes a cold front, he said. What do you think causes it? The passage says it's when cold air pushes under warm air, but then it says cold air is heavier. She looked up at him. So if cold air is heavier, why does it go under? Shouldn't heavier things sink? He looked at her. She'd read the passage more carefully than it probably deserved, found a genuine conceptual tension in it, and instead of glossing over it had stopped and asked the question. You're right that cold air is denser, he said, setting down the grocery bag. And it does sink. It pushes underneath the warm air and forces the warm air up. That's exactly what a cold front is. The passage is actually describing the same thing you're saying, just not clearly. She thought about this. So the textbook's right, but it's explained badly. That happens a lot. That's annoying. Also happens a lot. He put the milk in the refrigerator. Finish the worksheet. Dinner in 40 minutes. She went back to the worksheet with slightly less antagonism toward it, which was the best he could usually hope for. He made pasta. Simple, fast, the kind of meal that required half his attention and left the other half free. He thought about the 32nd floor. He thought about the specific weight of what had been offered and what it would mean in practical terms. The salary figure Ava had mentioned was enough to move them. Not extravagantly. Just out of the category of people who counted weeks until paychecks, and into the category of people who could make a decision about a repair or a specialist visit without running spreadsheets in their head first. It was the difference between managing and stable, the gap he'd been trying to close for 4 years. He thought about Sophie running at recess without stopping. He thought about the bathroom wall in their apartment with the mold that kept coming back, about the carpet pulling up at the corners, about the air quality that Dr. Anand had diplomatically described as suboptimal for her condition. He drained the pasta. He thought about Claire, not with the old grief fog, that had thinned enough over 4 years that he could think about her clearly now, could access specific memories without them dissolving into the general ache. He thought about what she would have said, not as a way of seeking permission, but because she'd been the clearest thinker he'd ever known, and occasionally he still ran things through that mental template just to see what came out. She would have asked 2 questions. Is this real? And is this right? In that order. Is it real? Ava Cross had offered him a role because she'd observed his work for 11 weeks and believed he was qualified for it. That was real in every documented, verifiable sense. Her history with him, the night in the rain 5 years ago, had accelerated the timeline, not manufactured the conclusion. He believed that, not because he needed to, but because the evidence supported it. Is it right? He'd earned the role. He had the skills. He'd been doing the work already. Accepting something you'd earned wasn't arrogance. It was just honesty about what you deserved, which was, as he told a woman in a garage waiting room a long time ago, the hard part. He put the pasta on the table. "Sophie," he called, "dinner!" She came in with the worksheet finished. He could tell by the way she set it aside rather than carrying it, and climbed into her chair and looked at the bowl in front of her, and then up at him. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "You have your thinking face." He served himself. "What does my thinking face look like?" "Like you're doing math, but the math is about feelings." He looked at her across the table. His daughter, gap-toothed and serious, who had apparently developed an accurate taxonomy of his facial expressions without telling him. "Something happened at work today," he said. "Nothing bad. Actually," he stopped, reconsidered. "Something that might be good. I'm still figuring it out." "What kind of good?" "The kind that changes some things." She ate a few bites. He could see her processing. She did this, held information for a while before asking the next question, which was a quality he'd always admired and also occasionally found unnerving because he never knew exactly when the follow-up was coming. "Good for us or just good for work?" she asked. "Both, if it works out." She nodded slowly, then, "Are you scared?" He looked at her. "A little." "Okay," she said, like that was the correct answer. Being scared is fine as long as you do it anyway. He didn't know exactly where she'd picked that up. Possibly from him, possibly from Mrs. Navarro, possibly from one of her books. But it landed exactly where it needed to. "Eat your dinner," he said. "Get." He called Roy that night, after Sophie was in bed. He didn't call often. They weren't phone call people. So Roy picked up on the second ring with the brisk attention of someone who'd registered that the call meant something. "Talk," Roy said. Ethan told him. Not everything. Not the garage, not the rain, not 5 years ago. That was Ava's story as much as his, and he wasn't going to spread it. But the offer, the role, the title, the salary, the Monday meeting. Roy was quiet for a long moment. "She offered you facilities operations manager," Roy said. "Yeah." Another pause. "That's been open since August." She said 4 months. "Gerald's been trying to get Kevin Marsh into that role since September," Roy said. His voice had a careful, particular flatness to it. "Kevin's been telling people in the department he was the internal candidate. That he had it." Ethan said nothing. He looked at the kitchen wall. "That explains some things," Ethan said. Yeah, Roy said. It does. He was quiet for another moment. She's right about the work, Ethan. I've had 4 maintenance techs in the overnight slot in 5 years. You're the first one I've had to chase to give tasks to because you'd already found them yourself. A pause. Take the job. You'd lose your best overnight tech. I'd gain a manager who actually knows the building. Roy's voice had the gruff practicality of a man who didn't do sentiment, but occasionally let function stand in for it. Take the job. After he hung up, Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. He had his logbook open in front of him, not for any specific reason, just the habit of having it near. He thought about Kevin Marsh finding out, about what that would look like, about the fact that it was going to get worse before it got better, that whatever investigation Ava had referenced would churn up things Kevin would try to redirect and complicate, and that Ethan would be at the center of it whether he wanted to be or not. He thought about whether that changed anything. It didn't. He closed the logbook. He went to bed. Tuesday, he worked his regular shift and said nothing to anyone about Monday morning. He did his work. He helped Elena's crew move a piece of equipment that was blocking the service corridor. He fixed a door seal on the 3rd floor that had been letting outside air in all week. He logged everything. Kevin appeared in the corridor at 2 in the afternoon. The timing, Ethan thought, was probably not coincidental. Kevin had likely heard from someone that Ethan had been upstairs Monday morning and had spent 36 hours deciding what to do with that information. Walker, Kevin said. His voice had a different quality than usual. Still controlled, still performing casualness, but with something tighter underneath it. Kevin, Ethan said. He was tightening a bolt on the doorframe and didn't stop. Heard you had a meeting Monday. Ethan didn't respond. Executive floor, Kevin said. That's unusual for maintenance. Facilities issues sometimes require executive sign-off, Ethan said. You'd be surprised. Kevin was quiet for a moment. He was trying to figure out what he'd actually been told and by whom, and whether Ethan was bluffing, and Ethan wasn't going to help him with any of those calculations. The conduct review is still open, Kevin said. Gerald hasn't issued a closeout yet. Ethan finished the bolt. He straightened. He turned and looked at Kevin Marsh with the full, direct attention he usually kept calibrated and level, and for just a moment he let it be something slightly different, not threatening, nothing that could be characterized as anything other than honest, just clear. The look of a man who was done managing the distance. Kevin, he said, I've been doing this job for 11 weeks. I have documentation for every hour of those 11 weeks. I have clean logs, a cleared overtime flag, a cleared documentation flag, and a direct supervisor who will tell you exactly what he's told me, which is that my work has been without issue. He held Kevin's gaze. If the conduct review has legitimate grounds, let Gerald present them to me formally and I'll address them. If it doesn't, then I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you want to spend the next part of your career. He wasn't making a threat. He genuinely wasn't. He was stating a fact in the only language that Kevin seemed to fully receive, direct institutional consequence. Kevin looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the folder he'd been carrying and left. Ethan turned back to the doorframe. He checked the seal. It was solid. He made a note in his logbook about the conversation, time, location, what was said, because he'd told himself he wouldn't make mistakes, and documentation was not a mistake. It was a record. Wednesday morning, he took the executive elevator again. Diane was expecting him. She had his water ready without being asked, which he appreciated, and she didn't make him wait this time. Just nodded at the office door 3 minutes after he sat down. Ava was at her desk this time, which was different from Monday's arrangement. She looked up when he came in and studied his face for a moment with the attention of someone trying to read a result before it was announced. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a second, not performing anything, just sitting with it for a moment the way people sat with things that mattered. Good, she said. I have conditions, he said. She looked at him. Tell me. The conduct review gets closed before my start date in the new role. Formally, in writing, with a copy to my file and Sandra's records. Already in motion, she said. Kevin Marsh has been referred to an internal review process as of this morning. Gerald was informed last night. The review will be completed within the week. He'd expected this to take longer. He kept his expression steady. What does that mean for Kevin specifically? That's not information I can share with you, she said, but I can tell you that the review is not a formality. He nodded. That was the right answer. She hadn't promised him an outcome to make him feel better. She told him the process was real. He respected the distinction. Second condition, he said, I want to be onboarded properly, not thrown in. I know the building systems, I know the crew, but facilities operations management involves procurement and contractor relationships and budget oversight that I haven't worked at that level. I need time to learn those functions correctly. I'll assign you a month of parallel operations with Sandra before full transfer, she said. She knows every procurement relationship in the building, and she'll teach you what she knows. Third, he said, Roy stays as senior tech with full salary adjustment. If I'm moving to management, Roy carries more of the technical load by default. He should be compensated for it. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention, like a person noting something they hadn't expected to see in a particular place. That's not your condition to set, she said. Roy's compensation is between Roy and HR. I know. I'm asking you to make sure the conversation happens. She studied him for a moment. Done, she said. He nodded. She stood, and he stood, and they shook hands across the desk. Not the managed professional handshake of a transaction, but the brief, direct grip of two people who had come to an understanding that had weight to it. Start date is 2 weeks from Monday, she said. I'll have the contract ready by Friday. He was almost at the door when she said, Walker. He turned. The 3 conditions, she said. None of them were about you. He thought about that. The job is about me. The conditions were about the things the job requires. She looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, she said. That's what I mean. He went back downstairs. The following week had the quality of 2 different timelines running simultaneously. In one, the formal world. HR's internal review of Kevin Marsh moved with a speed that Ethan suspected was Ava's doing, even if the mechanics were institutional. Sandra confirmed on Thursday that the conduct review on Ethan's file had been formally closed and his record cleared. She said it in her flat administrative voice and handed him a copy of the closure notice, and he took it and thanked her, and she said, Don't thank me, keep the copy, which he already intended to do. Kevin disappeared from the second floor for 3 days midweek, out of office, no explanation given, the kind of absence that in HR terms meant something was being resolved in a room he wasn't able to leave easily. When he returned, he was quieter. The particular quality of his presence in the building had changed, not eliminated, but reduced, the way a pressure system reduced after a front passed through. Gerald was visibly uncomfortable around Ethan for the remainder of that week, which Ethan took as its own kind of confirmation. In the other timeline, the personal one, things were less clean. Mrs. Navarro found out about the promotion on Friday because Sophie told her, because Ethan had told Sophie on Wednesday night and had failed to anticipate his daughter's relationship with information she considered good news. She told me everything, Mrs. Navarro said when Ethan came to pick Sophie up Friday afternoon. The job, the salary, the new office. It's not an office, Ethan said. She said office. She has a generous interpretation of the facilities operations suite. Mrs. Navarro looked at him for a moment with the expression she had, the one that was somewhere between exasperation and affection, and had been directed at him consistently since he and Sophie had moved into the building 3 years ago. She was 61, had raised 4 children in this building, and considered herself more or less responsible for the welfare of the whole floor, and she had an opinion about most things that she shared without much scaffolding. Your wife would be happy, she said. He looked at her. I know you didn't ask me, she said. I'm telling you anyway. He looked at the floor for a second, then back at her. Yeah, he said. She would have. Mrs. Navarro nodded once with the finality of someone who'd said the thing they needed to say and wasn't going to elaborate. Then she called Sophie from the back room and told her to get her bag. Sophie appeared in the doorway with her backpack and a drawing she was carrying carefully with 2 hands. Another crayon house he saw, with a red door, but this one had 2 people standing in front of it and a smaller figure between them. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to the two larger figures. "That's you," she said, pointing to one. She pointed to the other. "That's your friend from work." He looked at the drawing. He looked at his daughter. "We're not exactly friends," he said. Sophie shrugged, with the magnificent indifference of a child who had made an assessment and was not particularly interested in being corrected. "You will be," she said. He took the drawing. He carried it home. The contract arrived Friday afternoon, as Ava had said it would, PDF on his personal email from Crosstech's legal department, with a cover note from Diane about where to sign and the deadline for return. He printed it at the library because it was 22 pages, and he wasn't going to sign something he hadn't read, which meant the next 3 hours were him at the library table, going through every clause with the methodical attention he gave everything. It was clean. He'd expected conditions, buried provisions, things that would claw back what the offer had given, and there were none. Salary as stated, benefits as stated. The title was listed as Facilities Operations Manager, Crosstech Group, with direct report to the Director of Property and Infrastructure, who reported to the Executive Suite. The contract term was 2 years with renewal option and a 60-day notice clause for either party. There was a standard non-disclosure provision that was narrower than he'd seen at some companies, specific to proprietary building systems and vendor contracts, not a blanket gag, and a non-compete that was geographically limited and reasonable. He signed it at the library table with a pen he borrowed from the librarian and returned promptly, and scanned it and emailed it back, and then sat for a moment with the original in front of him. His name was on the first page in the party designation, Ethan Walker, hereinafter referred to as employee. Below Ava Cross's signature block on the last page, which she'd already signed, the ink was slightly different color. She'd signed the physical copy and scanned it, he could tell, rather than using digital signature, which meant she'd printed it and signed it by hand, which was a small thing and probably meant nothing, but he noticed it. He folded the contract and put it in the folder with the eviction notice he'd been keeping since September. The notice that had stopped being a countdown and started being a closed chapter. He looked at both documents together for a second. Then he closed the folder. Shem. Roy's reaction to the salary adjustment came the following Monday, which was Ethan's last full week in the overnight maintenance role before the transition began. Roy found him in the corridor at the start of shift with the expression of a man who'd been informed of something unexpected and hadn't entirely finished processing it. "Sandra told me," Roy said. "I asked Ava to make sure the conversation happened," Ethan said. "The rest was between you and HR." Roy stood there for a moment. He wasn't a man who was comfortable with gratitude, and he wasn't going to perform it, but something in the quality of his presence had shifted slightly. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. "My daughter's school of choice sent her an application," Roy said. "Out-of-state marine biology program. Did she apply?" "She applied." He paused. "The salary adjustment helps with that." Ethan nodded. Roy nodded back. That was the whole conversation. Kevin Marsh's formal outcome was announced midweek through a building-wide HR notice that was phrased in the bloodless institutional language of compliance, a finding of procedural misconduct related to misuse of documentation access and targeted filing practices, resulting in a demotion and transfer to a different department with reduced access privileges. His name wasn't in the notice. These things never name names officially. But buildings were small ecosystems. And by end of day Wednesday, everyone who worked the floors Ethan worked knew exactly who the notice was about. He didn't feel satisfaction about it, which surprised him slightly. He'd thought he might. But what he felt was mostly just the absence of a weight he'd been carrying for 2 months, which was its own kind of relief. Quieter, less dramatic than vindication, more like putting down something heavy and noticing that your arms had been tired. Sandra forwarded him a copy of the closure notice with a note that said simply, "For your records." He filed it behind the signed contract. His last overnight shift was Thursday. He came in at 10, the way he always had, and did the work the way he always did it. The 6th floor HVAC check, the server room inspection, the corridor walkthrough, the end-of-shift log. The building was quiet in the specific way it was always quiet after midnight. that particular suspension of daytime activity that made it feel like a different building than the one full of people and motion, and Ethan moved through it with the ease of someone who'd learned its rhythms and its small complaints and its particular personality over 11 weeks of close attention. He ran into Marcus at the lobby desk at 2 a.m. during a walkthrough. "Last night?" Marcus asked. "Last night for this shift." Marcus poured him a cup of coffee from the pot he kept behind the desk. The good kind, the one Marcus maintained as a personal standard independent of what the company provided. Ethan took it and stood at the desk for a few minutes, and they talked about nothing in particular. A sports result from the previous weekend, a news story Marcus had been following, the question of whether the lobby plants had been looking worse lately, or whether it was the light. "You fixed that threshold plate," Marcus said, nodding at the lobby entrance. "Week 3, Ethan said. "I'd been tripping on it for 6 months. Marcus looked at it for a moment. "I put in 3 work orders." "I know, I saw them in the backlog." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Nobody fixed it for 6 months. You fixed it without a work order in your 2nd week." "It was a tripping hazard," Ethan said. "I know what it was." Marcus looked at him. "I'm just noting the difference." Ethan finished his coffee. He set the cup on the desk. "Thanks for the coffee, Marcus." "Good luck with the new role," Marcus said. He was finishing his final log entry at 4:50 in the morning when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize, which turned out, when he read it, to not be from someone he didn't recognize at all. The logbook was the right call. AC. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about how she'd found his personal number, which would not have been difficult given her access to personnel files, and would have required approximately 30 seconds. He thought about the fact that she'd texted rather than called, and at 4:50 in the morning, which meant she was awake. He typed back, "You're up early." The response came in about 2 minutes. "You're up late." He looked at that for a second. Then he put his phone in his pocket and finished the log entry and closed the book and set it on Sandra's desk for the record, the way he'd set every log there for 11 weeks. He walked out through the lobby. Marcus buzzed him out. The morning air was cold and clear, and the city was beginning its early shift, the particular thin light of 5 a.m. when the night workers were ending and the day workers hadn't started, and the streets belonged briefly to neither. He sat in his car. He didn't drive yet. He sat with his hands on the wheel and the contract in the folder on the passenger seat, and the last 11 weeks sitting somewhere in his chest in a form he didn't have complete language for. He'd come to this building desperate and had kept that desperation behind his face where it belonged, had done the work that was in front of him with everything he had because that was the only thing he knew how to do, had kept his record clean under pressure that was designed to dirty it, and had ended up here, 5 a.m. on a Thursday in November, with something that looked, for the first time in 4 years, like ground. Not perfect, not solved in every dimension. The apartment still needed to change. Sophie's condition was managed, but not gone. The world had its ongoing ways of being difficult. He was 32 years old and tired in the specific deep way of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and determination for 4 years without adequate rest, and that didn't fix itself overnight. But ground, actual ground. He started the car and drove home through the empty streets, and the city moved past the windows in the early pale light, and he thought about Sophie sleeping in her room with the clean air coming through the filter he'd installed in September, breathing evenly, her lungs doing what they were supposed to do. He thought about Claire. He thought, I'm worth starting over for. He set it to the windshield in the empty car, quietly, and it came out a little rough around the edges because it was the kind of thing that was easier to say to a stranger than to yourself. But it was true, and it had always been true. And somewhere in the long, difficult interval between the night he'd said it and the morning he was driving through, he'd started to believe it. He got home at 5:20. He checked on Sophie. She was sleeping with her arm over her eyes the way she always slept, her breathing quiet and even. He went to bed. In 5 hours, he'd start something new. He slept 4 hours and woke up before the alarm. That was how it had always been with him, the body understanding that something was different before the mind had fully processed it, some internal system that didn't trust the alarm clock when the stakes were high enough. He lay in bed for a few minutes in the early morning dark, listening to the building, the radiator, the traffic below, the particular silence from Sophie's room that meant she was still asleep. He'd been listening to those sounds for 3 years in this apartment, and he knew their textures the way you knew the sounds of any place you'd lived long enough for it to become the background noise of your life. In 2 weeks, they'd be leaving it. He told Sophie the night before, after dinner, in the matter-of-fact way he tried to handle large changes. Not building up to it, not managing her response in advance, just saying the thing clearly and letting her react. They were going to move. Better neighborhood, better air, a 2-bedroom with a 2nd bathroom, and a window in Sophie's room that faced east so she'd get morning light. She'd listen to the whole thing with the focused attention she gave important information. Then she'd asked, "Can I pick the color of my room?" Within reason. What does within reason mean? It means not neon orange. She'd thought about this. What about a dark green, like a forest? He'd told her they could look at paint samples. She'd gone back to her book apparently satisfied, which was Sophie's version of enthusiasm. Not performance, just a quiet recalibration of her internal map to include the new information, already planning. He got up and made coffee and stood in the kitchen in the early light, looking at the crayon house on the wall, the one with the red door and the 2 figures and the smaller one between them. Sophie had put it up there weeks ago and he hadn't moved it, and at some point it had stopped being a thing he noticed and started being part of the room, the way things did when they belonged. He took it down carefully and set it on the counter. He was bringing it with them. The first month in the new role was exactly as hard as he'd expected, and in the ways he'd expected, which made it manageable. Sandra was his primary teacher in all the functions he hadn't held at this level: procurement relationships, contractor negotiations, budget oversight, the internal documentation systems that governed large-scale repair authorization. She taught the way she did everything, directly, without ornament, with the occasional precise observation that cut through complexity and told you what the thing actually was under all its procedural clothing. She had 14 years of institutional knowledge in this building, and she dispensed it efficiently, without territorial hoarding, which Ethan recognized as a form of professional generosity that was less common than it should have been. The HVAC contractor, Broadfield Systems, will try to bill you for diagnostic hours that are included in the service agreement, she told him in their 2nd week. They've been doing it for 3 years. Gerald never caught it because Gerald didn't read the agreements closely. I've been flagging it in my records, but I didn't have authority to push back on it. Ethan looked at the agreement she'd pulled up. She was right. Diagnostic assessment for standard systems was explicitly covered in the base contract rate, and Broadfield had been billing a separate line item for it. 3 years of invoices. The overpayment was significant. "Can we recover the back amount?" he asked. "I don't know. That depends on whether legal wants to pursue it." She looked at him. "But we can stop paying it going forward. That part I can confirm." He drafted a letter to Broadfield that afternoon, politely and specifically, citing the contract language and noting that diagnostic billing would be returned to the agreed structure effective immediately. He sent it up the chain to the Director of Property and Infrastructure, a man named Douglas Hale, who'd been in the role for 8 years, and who had received Ethan's appointment with the guarded professionalism of someone who would form opinions based on evidence and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Douglas read the letter, asked 2 questions about the contract language, and approved it. "Good catch," he said, which from Douglas Hale was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Ethan sent the letter. Broadfield called 2 days later, less than pleased. The conversation lasted 12 minutes, did not escalate above controlled, and ended with Broadfield agreeing to the corrected billing structure. Ethan documented the call, the agreement, and the new billing expectations, and sent the summary to Sandra and Douglas. Sandra sent back a single sentence. "This took you 9 days." He understood what she meant. It had taken him 9 days to accomplish something that had been sitting unresolved for 3 years. Not because the solution was complicated, it wasn't, but because nobody had been paying close enough attention to the specifics, or because those who had noticed hadn't been positioned to act. That was what the job actually was. He was learning, not the technical work, which he already knew. It was the attention, sustained and systematic, applied to the level where small wrong things accumulated into large expensive ones. He was built for that. He'd been built for it before he'd known what to call it. Roy adjusted to the new structure with the pragmatic ease of a man who'd been hoping something like this would happen even if he hadn't articulated it. He called Ethan boss exactly once, with a tone that made clear he was testing the word to see if it would take. And when Ethan said, "Roy, if you call me that again, I'll have you reroute every drain on 6," Roy had made a sound that was possibly the closest thing to a laugh that Ethan had ever heard from him and had not used the word again. What changed was the quality of their working relationship, less parallel and more layered. Roy handling the technical execution and Ethan handling the system oversight, each trusting the other's competence in their domain without needing to prove it daily. It was a functional partnership in the way the best working relationships were functional, not harmonious in a performed sense, occasionally argumentative about specific decisions, built on mutual respect that had been established by observation and not by conversation. Roy's daughter was accepted to her marine biology program in February. Roy mentioned it on a Thursday morning in the maintenance corridor with the particular restrained expression of a man who was very proud and was managing not to make a large production of it. "She got in," he said. "Which school?" Roy named it. It was the one she'd wanted most. Ethan extended his hand. Roy shook it. They went back to work. The salary adjustment had helped, Roy had told him once, briefly and without elaboration. Ethan didn't ask him to elaborate. Some things were complete in their simple form. The new apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 6 blocks from Sophie's school, which meant she could theoretically walk to school in good weather, which was a thing she treated as a serious and immediate priority from the moment she understood it was possible. The building was newer, the air handling was modern, the windows were double pane and sealed, and the bathroom wall was clean. Ethan checked it himself before they signed the lease, running his hand along the base of the wall with the professional attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for and what it felt like when it wasn't there. It wasn't there. Sophie's room was a real bedroom, full-sized, east-facing window, enough space for her bed and her desk, and the small bookshelf she'd been filling steadily since she was 5. They'd bought paint samples, as promised, and she'd spent a Saturday afternoon holding swatches against the wall in the afternoon light with the concentration of a person making a considered architectural decision. She had settled on a color called Pine Ridge, which was exactly the dark green she'd described, like a forest. Moving day was a Saturday in late January, and it was bitterly cold, which was less than ideal for moving furniture and exactly the kind of thing that happened because real life did not schedule inconveniences around your timeline. Mrs. Navarro appeared at the old apartment at 8 in the morning with a thermos of hot chocolate for Sophie and the general demeanor of someone who intended to be useful and could not be dissuaded. "You don't have to," Ethan started. "I know I don't have to," Mrs. Navarro said, in the tone she used when she was done with the conversation. She spent the day wrapping breakables in newspaper and directing the 2 men from the moving company and telling Sophie which box contained her most important things, which Sophie had labeled simply "important" in large letters with a marker. By 2 in the afternoon, they were in the new apartment with everything in approximately the right rooms, and Mrs. Navarro sat at the kitchen table with her thermos and a satisfaction that was visible from across the room. "This is a good kitchen," she said. "The ventilation's better," Ethan agreed. "I wasn't talking about ventilation." She looked around. "It has room. Your old kitchen had room for 1 person and the ghost of 1 person." He didn't answer that. She wasn't wrong. Sophie came out of her room, already partially set up. She'd prioritized the bookshelf, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around at the boxes and the new walls and the afternoon light coming in at an angle that was different from any light they'd had before. "It smells different," she said. "New place always does," Mrs. Navarro said. "Good different," Sophie said. She went back to her room. They ordered pizza for dinner, the 3 of them, sitting on the floor of the new living room because the furniture wasn't arranged yet and none of them felt like arranging it. And it was one of those evenings that didn't have a particular significance in the moment, but that Ethan knew, with some part of him that had learned to recognize these things, he would remember for a long time. Mrs. Navarro told a story about moving into her own first apartment 40 years ago, which had involved a broken elevator and a couch she'd eventually had to leave in the stairwell and retrieve 3 days later with additional assistance. Sophie asked questions about the couch with the investigative interest of someone assessing a logistical puzzle. Ethan ate his pizza and listened to the two of them and looked at the new walls and felt something he recognized after a moment as ease. Not happiness in a declarative sense, just the absence of the particular strain that had been present so long it had become invisible until it lifted. The mold was gone. The eviction notice was in a folder in a box. His daughter was breathing evenly in a room with clean air and a forest green wall, asking Mrs. Navarro detailed structural questions about a couch in a stairwell 40 years ago. Dr. Anand's follow-up appointment was in March, 3 months into the controller medication and 2 months into the new apartment. Sophie sat on the examination table in the paper gown that she had strong opinions about. It sounds like someone crumpling a grocery bag every time I move, while Dr. Anand went through the assessment with his usual patient thoroughness. Ethan sat in the chair in the corner and watched. The numbers were better, significantly better. Peak flow measurements, symptom frequency, nighttime event rate. All of them had moved in the right direction by enough margin that Dr. Anand allowed himself a visible response, which for him meant a contained smile and a note made with slightly more emphasis than usual. The environmental change made a real difference, Dr. Anand said, looking at the comparison chart. Combined with the medication, she's in a substantially better position than she was 6 months ago. Better enough to run at recess? Sophie asked. He looked at her over his reading glasses. Better enough to run at recess. Better enough to try out for the soccer team? He looked at Ethan briefly. There's a spring league, Ethan said, for her age group. Let's talk about that at the next appointment, Dr. Anand said. For now, I'd say limited to moderate exertion with her rescue inhaler accessible. But the trajectory is good, Sophie. You're doing the right things. The medication still tastes terrible, she said. I know, he said. I'm sorry about that. You could fix it. I could not. I'm a pulmonologist, not a pharmacist. She thought about this with the expression of someone noting an institutional failure. Someone should fix it. They should, he agreed. In the car afterward, heading back through the city in the mid-morning traffic, Sophie was quiet for a while with the quality of quiet that meant she was processing rather than disengaged. Dad? She said. Yeah. Doctor. Anand said I'm doing better because of the apartment and the medicine. He did. The apartment and the medicine are because of the job. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window. Yeah, he said, and the job is because you kept doing good work even when that guy was trying to stop you. He didn't say anything for a second. So basically, she said, still looking out the window, my lungs are better because you didn't give up. He thought about how to respond to this, about how much of the fuller picture to share, about Ava, about the garage, about the rain and the coffee and the sentence he'd said to a stranger that had traveled 5 years and come back to him in a different form. Sophie was 9 now, nearly 10, and her capacity for context was larger than it used to be, but some stories had dimensions that required more years than she had yet, not because she couldn't understand them technically, but because understanding them fully required having lived through enough difficulty to know what it cost. Something like that, he said. She seemed to accept this as sufficient. I'm going to try out for the soccer team, she said. We'll talk to Dr. Anand about it at the next appointment. That means yes. That means we'll talk to Dr. Anand about it. She turned from the window and looked at his reflection in the mirror with the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was simply giving the process time to catch up. Okay, she said. Well, the company family event was in May, a Saturday afternoon in the park adjacent to the Crosstech building. The kind of thing that companies organized annually with a mix of genuine intention and HR obligation, and that usually landed somewhere in the middle of both. There were tables and food, and a space for children, and a section of lawn for the various organized activities that someone in events had determined would foster connection. Ethan had considered not bringing Sophie, not because he thought she'd be uncomfortable, but because the line between his work life and his personal life was one he maintained carefully, not from shame, but from a sense that they were different registers and mixing them required intention. But Sophie had asked specifically whether she could come, and when he'd asked why, she'd said, I want to see where you work. You talk about the building like it's a person. He told her that wasn't entirely inaccurate. She came. Roy was there with his wife and his daughter, the marine biology daughter, who was taller than Ethan had imagined from the few things Roy had said about her, with her father's direct gaze and none of his reticence, and who spent approximately 4 minutes talking to Sophie before both of them went to find the food table, apparently having reached an understanding. Roy watched them go with the particular expression he used when something had happened that he approved of, but wasn't going to comment on. His wife, a woman named Patricia, who had the efficient warmth of someone who'd built a full life and was comfortable in it, shook Ethan's hand and said, "Roy talks about you, you know." "He doesn't seem the type," Ethan said. "He's not," she agreed. "But he does." Elena was there from the cleaning crew, with 2 of her team, and she found Ethan near the food and said, "The new cart still works, by the way," with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting a long-term result. And he laughed, actually laughed, which he hadn't done in the context of work for a long time, because it had been 6 months and she'd remembered. Marcus was off duty, but had come anyway, in regular clothes, and was standing near the drinks table with the ease of a man who liked people and was good at being around them. He waved when he saw Ethan. Ethan waved back. Sandra did not attend, which surprised no one. Sandra's relationship to organized social events was known and respected. He saw Ava from across the lawn, talking to Douglas Hale and one of the senior engineers from the 4th floor. She was in a lighter register than she was in the building. Not different exactly, but the particular focused containment she carried in professional contexts was slightly released, the way people were when they were technically at work, but technically also at a picnic, and the two facts created a mild conflict that most people resolved by leaning toward the picnic. She saw him at approximately the same moment, acknowledged him with a small nod. He nodded back. They didn't talk immediately, which was fine. They'd found a working rhythm over the past months, professional, direct, neither of them performing warmth they didn't have or distance that wasn't warranted. The conversation on the 32nd floor had established something that didn't require maintenance, which was the quality of the best understandings between people. It was just there, held between them without needing to be discussed. He'd thought, in the early weeks, about whether what she'd told him, the garage, the rain, the coffee, and the sentence, had changed something in how he understood the whole trajectory. Whether knowing that a moment of ordinary human decency had traveled forward in time and landed in this particular form made it feel different. Larger, maybe. Or weighted in a way that required a different kind of processing. What he'd arrived at, after enough time, was this. It didn't make it larger. It made it more honest. He'd helped a person who needed help because she needed help and he could help. He hadn't done it for a return. He hadn't been building toward anything. He'd been working late in a garage on a rainy night and someone had come in who was carrying more than a flat tire. And he'd done the thing that the situation called for, which was to be present and to be decent. That was the whole of it. The fact that the same person had later made choices that led to Crosstech, and that he'd ended up there, and that she'd recognized him and been in a position to act on what she'd observed. That wasn't fate. It wasn't a moral reward mechanism. It wasn't the universe operating on some principle of poetic accounting. It was just what happened when enough people behaved well enough over a long enough time. Things accumulated. Small acts of decency built on each other. The texture of a life that had been spent trying to do the right thing. Not perfectly, not without failure, not without the ugly, grinding difficulty of actual circumstances, eventually showed up somewhere as a different kind of ground. That was the thing worth knowing. Not as comfort, not as promise, but as plain observation. Who you are when no one's watching is the version of you that outlasts every other version. The threshold plate fixed at 6 a.m. in an empty lobby. The cart repaired on a slow Saturday. The sentence said to a stranger in a waiting room who was sitting with her head in her hands. None of it guaranteed anything. The world didn't run on guarantees, but it accumulated. He believed that now in a way he hadn't entirely believed it before, and not because things had worked out. Working out was not the confirmation of a principle, it was just a result, but because he'd watched it be true in both directions. He'd said something to a young woman who was starting over, and it had helped her decide she was worth the effort. And she, without knowing it was him, had looked carefully at his work and decided he was worth the investment. Neither of them had been performing for the other. They'd both just been trying to be honest about what they saw. That was the thing. That was what he'd carry. Sophie found him near the edge of the lawn, away from the main activity, eating a piece of the cake that the events team had commissioned in Crosstex brand colors, which she had assessed as more blue than necessary. Roy's daughter knows about fish, Sophie said. She's studying marine biology. She said there are fish that change color to communicate. She considered this. That's a useful skill. People do something similar, he said. Not with colors. No, with words. Same principle. She thought about this while eating her cake. The afternoon was warm, genuinely warm. Not the tentative warmth of early spring, but the full commitment of May. The sun high and the air clear, and the trees in the park along the perimeter fully leafed out. Sophie had been to 3 soccer tryout sessions. Doctor. Anand had approved moderate exertion with the inhaler accessible, and she'd appeared for the first session with the inhaler in her jacket pocket and the expression of someone who had come prepared for the practical objections. The coach had been accommodating. Sophie had been, by her own account and the coach's, decent. Not the best. Not immediately skilled, but focused and persistent in the way she was focused and persistent about everything she'd decided to do. She'd been selected for the spring team on a Tuesday afternoon and had texted Ethan from Mrs. Navarro's phone. 3 words, no punctuation, made the team. He'd been in the middle of a contractor call when the text came through. He'd looked at it, held the phone for a second, then put it back in his pocket and finished the call, and then stepped into the corridor and let himself feel it. The specific, full-bodied relief of something you'd been working toward for a long time, arriving not with a crash, but quietly. Like finding something in a drawer you'd been looking for so long you'd half-stopped believing it was there. Now she stood beside him in the May afternoon and ate blue-tinted cake and watched the people across the lawn. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Is that her?" She said it carefully, the way children said things when they understood they were asking about something they'd been given partial information about and were filling in the rest. He followed Sophie's gaze. Ava was moving away from the conversation with Douglas, walking in a path that would bring her across their side of the lawn. Not directly toward them, she was heading for the drinks table, but close. "Yeah," he said. Sophie watched her for a moment. Then she looked at her cake. "You should introduce me," she said. "Sophie, it would be rude not to," she said. "She's your boss." He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, with her mother's eyes and a soccer tryout under her belt, and a forest green bedroom and lungs that were moving correctly, eating blue cake in the May sunshine with the composure of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. He called out, "Miss Cross?" Ava turned. She registered Sophie first, the small person with the large eyes standing beside Ethan with a piece of blue cake, and something in her expression shifted before she'd had time to arrange it. Something quick and unmanaged that was closer to the person he'd sat with at 2 a.m. on a ventilation level than the CEO who ran meetings on the 32nd floor. She walked over. "Sophie," Ethan said, "this is Ava Cross. She runs the company." Sophie looked at her directly. Not shy, just assessing, the way she assessed everything. "He talks about the building like it's a person," Sophie said. Ava looked at Ethan briefly. "That sounds right?" "He fixed the cart," Sophie said. "I heard about the cart." "He does that." Sophie looked back at her cake, then back up. "He fixes things that nobody asked him to fix. He's been doing it my whole life." She said it matter-of-factly, not with the intent of a speech, just reporting observable data in the way that children sometimes reported things that the people living inside them hadn't found words for. "He fixed our apartment's ventilation. He fixed Mrs. Navarro's door hinge. He fixed the threshold plate in your lobby." "I know," Ava said. "I noticed." Sophie studied her for a moment. "He worked really hard," she said, "to give me a better life." She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without performance, just plainly and exactly the way it was. "I wanted to tell you that." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just full, the kind that came when something real had been said, and the space after it needed a moment. Ava looked at Sophie for a second that was slightly longer than standard, and there was something in her face that she didn't manage this time, something unguarded and honest. Then she looked at Ethan. He thought about a rainy night 5 years ago. He thought about a woman with her head in her hands. He thought about bad coffee from a waiting room machine and a sentence he'd meant sincerely and hadn't thought about again until it came back to him in an office on the 32nd floor with the force of something that had been traveling a long time. He thought about Sophie running at recess without stopping. He thought about the threshold plate in the cart and the logbook in his pocket through 12 weeks of nights and the 2 signatures at the bottom of a 2-year contract and Roy's daughter studying the ocean somewhere out of state. He thought about how none of it had been a plan, how he just kept doing the thing that needed doing, the way his father had done it and his father's father before that, not because a reward was coming, but because the work was there and he could do it, and that had always been enough reason. Ava looked at him and said quietly, so only he could hear it, "You told me I was worth starting over for." He nodded once. "I should have thanked you 5 years ago," she said. "You didn't know it was me," he said. "I know." She looked at Sophie for a moment, then back at him. "Thank you, for then and for now." He didn't have a response that fit the size of it, so he didn't try to find one. He just nodded again, and she nodded back, and it was complete in that form. They drove home in the late afternoon, Sophie in the back seat with her shoes off and her head against the window, watching the city go by in the golden light that came at that hour when the sun was low and the shadows were long and everything had a slight warmth to it that didn't belong to any other time of day. "I like her," Sophie said. "She's good at her job," Ethan said. "That's not what I said." He glanced in the mirror. Sophie was still looking out the window. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a while. Then, "Are we going to be okay?" He thought about the question. The real version of it, not the surface anxiety of a child asking after a hard day, but the genuine inquiry of a person who'd been paying attention to uncertainty for long enough to know it was a real variable. He thought about the new apartment and the clean walls and the medication that worked, and the forest green room and the contract in the folder, and the job that was the first thing in 4 years that felt like ground. He thought about the fact that none of it was guaranteed, that life maintained its prerogative to be difficult without warning, that he was 32 years old and still had the particular accumulated exhaustion of 4 years of managing alone, and that exhaustion didn't dissolve overnight even when the circumstances improved. That there would be other things, different things, things he couldn't see yet, that would require the same stubborn forward motion he'd been practicing since he was 28 years old, and the world had rearranged itself without asking. And he thought about the principle he'd been living, not perfectly, not always consciously, but consistently enough that Sophie had noticed, which meant it had been real. The principle that who you were when no one was looking was the only version of you that actually counted. That small acts of honesty and effort and basic human decency were not insignificant because they were small. That they accumulated into a life, and the life accumulated into other lives, and the whole complicated forward motion of it meant something even when you couldn't see the shape from where you were standing. He couldn't promise Sophie that nothing hard was coming. He couldn't promise that the world would keep behaving reasonably. He couldn't promise that his own health wouldn't falter, or that the company would hold, or that the next 4 years would be easier than the last. But he could tell her the truth. "Yeah," he said, "we're going to be okay." She looked at him in the mirror, held his eyes for a second with the dark, clear gaze that was her mother's, and that would always be her mother's. And that was one of the ways Claire remained present in the world. In a 9-year-old's eyes, watching her father from the back seat in the late afternoon light. "Okay," Sophie said. Like she believed it, like she had all along. She turned back to the window. The city moved past them in the golden hour, unhurried and large and full of people living their lives simultaneously, and Ethan drove them home through it. Not to the apartment they'd been surviving in, but to the place they'd begun, carefully and imperfectly, to actually live. The hardest chapter was over, not because the world had become easier, but because Ethan Walker had finally stopped asking himself if he was worth fighting for, and had simply decided once and for all that the answer was yes. The kindness he'd shown a stranger in the rain had come full circle, but the truth underneath it, the one that mattered most, was this. It had never been about the return. It had been about who he was, and who he was had been enough. It always had been.